Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. Hilaire Belloc, The Case for a Catholic Republic. Hilaire Belloc, along with his collaborator G.K. Chesterton, is among the best-known Catholic English writers of the 20th century, without overlooking Belloc's French heritage, which is an integral aspect to his political, historical, and religious outlook. Indeed, Belloc was a prolific writer. I have cited him as a historian, though he is renowned for his essays on a plethora of topics, his theological musings, and his travelogues, such as his 1902 Path to Rome and his 1925 Cruise of the Nona. But ultimately, Belloc is best known as an exponent of Leo XIII's famous socio-economic encyclical, Rerum Novarum, and the coiner of the term distributism. However, it came as a surprise to me to learn, delving deeper into Belloc, that he, a sage for Catholic reaction and a man who invested so much historical sympathy into his studies of Leo XIV, Leo XVI, and James II of England, was a Republican. Indeed, his biographer, Joseph Pearce, writing in 2002, attributes the following quotation to Belloc and presents it as a microcosm of Belloc's political philosophy. When you have reconciled the high stoicism of the Republic and the humility of the Catholic Church, then you will have the perfect state. The Republic he means is the Gallican Republic, a phrase which routinely crops up across his writings. The natural borders of Gaul served as a teleology for the French Revolutionaries, the Republicans who, according to Belloc, communed with antiquity, imbibed the philosophical and artistic aspects of Greece and Rome. It is impossible to understand what Belloc means by republic without understanding his perspective on the French Revolution. However, there is a tragic element associated with Belloc's romantic attachment to the Republic. In the following anecdote, a 22-year-old Belloc is speaking to the master of Balliol College, Oxford, Dr. Benjamin Jowett. The truth Dr. Jowett gave me came thus. He asked me the political question, which was always uppermost in his mind, and which he believed all young men should consider. It was, under what form of government is the state of man at its best? I answered, as all young men should answer, a republic, to which he answered gently in his turn, you cannot have a republic without republicans. Now that, for terseness and truth and a certain quality of revelation, was worthy of Aristotle, it is the full answer, historical and moral, to every honest man who desires, as most honest men do, democracy, and who wonders why it is so hard to attain. But I had never considered that answer, and I think if I had not heard these half-dozen words, I might never have considered it. Democracy, that is, the government of the community by the community, a state wherein a man stands equal with his fellows and has to suffer neither subservience nor the corruption of flattery and power, a state in which office alone commands, and not being clothed with office, that is, the ideal at the back of every man's mind who cares for the right in public affairs, and who has within himself anything left of private honour. It is simplest put by saying that democracy is the noblest form of government. But the moment you begin to deal with men, you find in varying degrees, according to the human material handled, a difficulty in direction of such an affair. You have experience of the wickedness and folly of men, and if you add to such growing experience the vast experience of history, you find that save in some few, and those small communities, the ideal of democracy must break down in practice, that so far from enjoying the noblest of social conditions, men attempting democracy in great states are soon suffering the basest forms of control by the rich. This is because most men, though intimately desiring a republic, are not republicans. When you have great numbers, those worthy of democracy are few. In the same way, most men, though individually desiring peace within, have not the control of themselves which makes such peace possible. So much for the master's excellent platitude. It is strange that things worth saying and hearing, guiding things, should always have that quality of turning into platitudes once they are familiar. For they were sudden revelations when they first came. To me now, the impracticability of democracy among men indifferent to honour and justice is so clear that I never pause to consider it, well knowing that you cannot have the thing in any modern plutocratic state, that even in small states it needs a peculiar admirable and rare temper in the human material of them. But this conviction came slowly, and all started from those words. So why do I believe this matters, and why am I devoting a discussion to this topic? Belloc's republicanism came at the beginning of the French Ralliement, Leo XIII's imploring, if not ordering, of the Catholic faithful to rally to the Third Republic as the legitimate constitution of the French state as a fait accompli, when that posture was and is highly contentious and even contradictory by the standards of what the papacy employed against other states, such as the Italian kingdom. It matters that such a towering intellect as Belloc for Catholics embraced the Ralliement before Christian democracy and Christian republicanism became ubiquitous after the Second World War. What implications does this have for Catholic monarchists? Then there is also a meta point. I presented his case for a Catholic republic with a question mark. I believe a case can be made that his republicanism was more patriotic than universal, that the cause of republicanism was incidental to more significant philosophies for Belloc, such as distributism and integralism. Finally, that his sympathy for monarchy would come to supersede his republican predilection, whilst he never becoming an outright monarchist. Now, thank you for listening to that, Theo, and thank you for being so patient. And I want to introduce you, Theo Howard. Hello, how are you doing?
Good evening, AM. Happy Sunday. It's a real pleasure to be back on the Apostolic Majesty podcast, and I'm looking forward to discussing this quite perplexing question of Belloc's political views, especially with regard to the great issues of his lifetime.
But first of all, I mean, not necessarily everyone has watched our previous discussion, which was the Intrusible Chamber covering the conceptual history of Carlism. You have your own channel, of course, the Two Cities podcast, and you now regularly write for Peter Five. Is that correct?
Yes, I do. I'm a contributing editor at 1 Peter 5, and my particular area of interest is Catholic social doctrine and the history of Christian civilization. That's the main focus of my channel, the Two Cities podcast as well, named after St. Augustine's famous work, viewing the panorama of contemporary events and also those of the past as the war between the earthly city and the city of God, with that Augustinian lens. And Belloc is an historian who I have derived many insights from in the course of my reading, but I've also been somewhat frustrated with as well, particularly on this issue of his admiration for the French Revolution, but also in several other elements. So he's a figure that I have great respect for, and admire many of his achievements and the kind of impact that he had on public discourse. I think the fact that he was a popular historian and really was able to shape public debate and public historical memory is very notable. But like all of us, I think he had his flaws.
So would you consider his republicanism a flaw?
Yeah, so last year I read Simon Schama's book, The French Revolution, on the recommendation of, in my view, one of the most impressive Catholic historians alive today, Dr. John Rao from the US, who pointed out that Simon Schama's history, although written by a secular homosexual Jew, actually is very detailed and rich in its criticism of the French Revolution and the terror that it unleashed, in particular in tracing the sources of that terror to the so-called Enlightenment ideas of the protagonists of the revolution. and it's unsparing. He is unsparing in his criticism of their tyrannical usurpation and misgovernance of France and the anarchy that they unleashed. So contrast that this history written by Simon Schama, this leftist Jewish historian, with the stance of Hilaire Belloc in his works that you've mentioned. I've got here The French Revolution, his book from 1911, in which he expresses this pretty fulsome admiration for at least the theory of the French Revolution, but also goes into defending much of the execution of it as well. So there's a real puzzle there, which I'm looking forward to getting into, trying to disentangle with you. But I think you've given a very important quote from The Path to Rome, that Belloc had this quixotic idealism about the ideal state. And I think that Dr. Alan Phimister expressed the reason for this very well when he said, quote, "In the end, it all comes down to Romanitas. For him, the political ideal was the Augustan Principate, the regime under which the Saviour was born, not as it was in fact, but as it was in theory, a republican monarchy. This had been corrupted in part by the despotic instincts of Hellenistic Greeks, and in part by the blood monarchy and aristocracy of the invading Germanic barbarians. When the people overthrew the monarchies and aristocracies of Europe at the end of the 18th century," okay, so there's a presupposition there that I wouldn't agree with, but that's what he says. Continuing, "It was just the long overdue revolt of the oppressed Roman population of the Mediterranean against their ghastly barbarian rulers." End quote.
And indeed, if I emphasized earlier the Gallic Republic, that I believe is a cornerstone to understanding a particular aspect of the French Revolution, which isn't just unique to the French. It also comes across in Walter Scott and the idea of the Norman yoke, this idea that there is some form of not just an aristocratic elite, but also an ethnic othering of the elites, which further substantiates the need to return to a pure, unabashed ethnos, and therefore the French Revolution could be seen to be an ethnogenesis. As for your aspect about Simon Schama, it actually doesn't surprise me, having also read Simon Schama, because he is first and foremost an art historian. And therefore you can look at the devastation of the French Revolution, especially as I've covered that previously with John Dee, talking about the scouring of France and the various crimes against culture that the French Revolution was guilty of, which is part of the terror, part of the crimes, part of that sense of usurpation. People are asking in the chat where Charles Coulomb is. Hopefully he's going to be joining us later. He's running late for now, so it's just going to be me and Theo for the first part of this conversation, but hopefully he'll join us later. But again, talking about the sort of the fundamental crux of the French Revolution as being an invitation to Belloc, I thought it would be quite interesting, if not quite fun, to contrast his sympathy for aspects of the French Revolution whilst prefacing it with the most scathing critique that we perhaps have on the French Revolution from a contemporary point of view, which is Joseph de Maistre's consideration on France. And I've taken certain segments of this, Theo, because they stand almost in direct juxtaposition to what not just Hilaire Belloc would present, but also elements of French republicanism and the ralliement writ large. He seems to be speaking to the same time frame as Hilaire Belloc. He's writing in the 1790s as if he's also chastising the complicit French republicans of the 1890s and 1900s. So it begins like this. And also it comes to points regarding Gallicanism, which you and I are also very invested in as a topic. France exercises a magistracy over Europe. I'm paraphrasing. Providence, which always proportions the means to the end, and which gives to nations as to individuals the necessary organs for the accomplishment of their goals, has given the French nation precisely two instruments, two arms, so to speak, with which to stir up the world: the French language and the spirit of proselytism, that forms the essence of the nation's character. Consequently, France constantly has both the need and the power to influence men. The power, I almost said the monarchy of the French language, is visible. You can at most only pretend to doubt it, and the spirit of proselytism is as obvious as to the sun from the fashion designer to the philosopher. It is the salient trait of the national character. This proselytism is commonly ridiculed, and really, in the forms it takes, often merits ridicule. Fundamentally, however, it is an office, and what he means by an office, it is also a responsibility to broader Christendom, not just of European civilization. And just to really buttress that, because I think you'll agree with me here, what he's alluding to is the fact that over the course of the latter half of the 17th century and the 18th century, from the reign of Louis XIV onwards, he references the sun, which is only appropriate because Leo XIV adopted elements of Apollo. He was the Sun King. It wasn't just a statement of France's cultural power, but it was also the fact that the whole court system of France, the nobility in Versailles, operated as the suns and planetary orifices do, and the planets orbit the sun, and how the French language, French customs, French court rituals, they became replicated throughout all of Europe, from Baden to Württemberg to Sanssouci in Prussia to the Catherine Palace in St. Petersburg. All across Europe, French mores and fashions were being adopted, and therefore, according to someone like de Maistre, it is incumbent upon France to be that great cultural ambassador. And I think what I find rather distressing about Belloc's republicanism, obviously we're going to get more into this, is if you accept that principle, that France occupies that position, which is a Gallican position. He's also going to explain the church position, so I'll hold off and talk about the Catholic elements just for now, but just talking about the culture and the political aspects of it. If France is a republic, then by extension, France will breed republicanism throughout the rest of Europe and throughout the rest of Christendom. And in this sense, again, he is prophetic in his words, because France becomes a republic, really entrenched in its republican status by the 1880s. And by the 1920s, most governments across Europe are republics, if not directly imitating the French Republic, such as the Republic in Portugal, such as the Second Republic in Spain in the 1930s, and perhaps again, most notably, the Republic of Czechoslovakia. So do you agree with him that France has a responsibility compared to other nations?
Notice there the two things, although you juxtaposed the contrast there between de Maistre and Belloc. Notice what they do both share, which is this this almost irresolvable, this unchallenged view of Gallican supremacy, which is a particular characteristic of the French temperament that I think shouldn't be maybe unquestioningly accepted. And I don't just say that just because I'm an Englishman. In 1303, I think it was, when Pope Boniface VIII was in contestation with King Philip IV
King
of
Philip
France.
IV, the Iron King. Yes, I understood. I can already expect the horrific sort of tirades of against Philip IV incoming. And yes, continue.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say they were necessarily horrific. I mean, they were strong, but I would agree with the Pope's criticisms of Philip and his.
Oh, indeed, I'm agreeing with you. I think what is more horrific is, I mean, with Boniface VIII is the Pope you're referring to. I've referenced Unum Sanctum, which is one of the most clear and vocal aspects of the two swords and the sun and the moon.
Yeah.
And obviously, with Boniface VIII, it wasn't just the forceful relocation of the papacy from Rome to Avignon, but it's also the culpability that Philip IV has in the death of Boniface VIII through his notare, denogere. And also we have the elimination of the Knights Templar, but that's really another question. But yes, sorry, I've interrupted you.
That's quite right. Yes, he who tries to eat the Pope dies, which is the fate that Philip IV met. And that document, Unum Sanctum, is the closest thing really to a constitution of Christendom as a whole. So very important papal teaching there, even after the unity of Christendom had passed its apogee, sadly. But in 1303, in a consistory, Boniface VIII said, quote, "Just as the moon has no light except that which it receives from the sun, so too no earthly power has anything except that which it receives from ecclesiastical power. All powers derive from Christ and from us as vicar of Jesus Christ. Nor should Gallican pride arise here, which claims to recognize no superior. They lie, for de jure they are and must be under the Roman emperor and king." End quote. So this, incessant French idea fix that they are the leader of mankind, the preeminent nation of mankind as the eldest daughter of the church, I think is something that shouldn't just be sort of uncritically accepted, as much as de Maistre and Belloc would champion that view. So 2 points you made there, two, I would say, interpretive keys to understanding this position of Belloc on the French Revolution, which are, first of all, this nearly hysterical French nationalism, and then secondly, his economic views. I think they are actually antecedent to his historical views on the French Revolution. That they are the two commitments, the intellectual commitments that shape his views on the French Revolution first and foremost. So we can return to those later.
Yes, and just to buttress your points, because de Maistre then goes on to say, moreover, there is an eternal law of the moral world, that every office employs a duty. The Gallican Church was a cornerstone of the Catholic system, or better, the Christian system, for in truth there is only one. Although they may perhaps doubt it, churches opposing the universal church subsist only by virtue of its existence. So again, we can qualify essentially elements of the Gallican Church, but that's only to reiterate the points that you've already made. It follows that the greatest efforts of the goddess of reason against Christianity should take place in France, the enemy against the citadel. And this is what I mean essentially by, it's not just referring to Catholicism, but in general, a famous idiom of the 19th century went that once France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. Evil has nothing in common with life. It cannot create, since its power is purely negative. Evil is the schism of being. It is not true. Now, what distinguishes the French Revolution and makes it an event unique in history is that it is radically bad. No element of good disturbs the eye of the observer. It is the highest degree of corruption ever known. It is pure in purity. And again, I emphasize that because if there is going to be any rebuke of any attempt to show any aspect of sympathy, you cannot have, from the point of view of de Maistre, sympathy with something that is the most corrupt force ever known, that is pure impurity. So I'm just going to hold that off because, again, I'm intentionally trying to understand the greatest sort of opposition to this idea before we explore it more. But just before we get into Belloc's views, what do you personally think about that assessment, sort of very briefly and concisely?
Well, Joseph de Maistre's Considerations on the Revolution in France is a masterpiece, and I find that it's one of the most incisive critiques of the devastation wrought in France by this rationalistic pursuit to the very bitter end of the logic of the Enlightenment project by the French Revolutionaries. And as you sampled there, he has a marvelous rhetorical style which doesn't lose its power in English either. And I think that's something to bear in mind with both de Maistre and Belloc, that they were both romantics. And so there's that other aspect to this, which is that the style, the rhetoric, the polemic itself carries a certain exaggeration. I, as I say, really value Belloc's work in many ways, but I favour, for example, Christopher Dawson as a Catholic historian, who's much more of an empiricist than the Romanticist Belloc. And de Maistre is quite right in his criticism and characterization of the French Revolution as satanic. The fact that Belloc really doesn't recognize that, even in the worst moments of the terror, making excuses for the atrocities committed and so on, is very troubling. I don't think de Maistre is entirely sort of beyond reproach. There are issues there, I think, with the ways in which he dabbled with perennialism and so one or two other things. But yes, in this sense, he's I think got a much clearer view of the French Revolution, what it represented, and just to say that he is right in that Europe does follow the fashions of France, even more so at that time. And I do think that the nations have particular vocations, national temperaments. Dr. Plinio Correa de Oliveira talks about the primordial lights of the nation, and he talks about how France sets the fashions for the world. I think there's a lot of truth to that. That doesn't necessarily justify, as I pointed out earlier, the sort of Gallican pride of usurping, revolting against first the emperor and then the Pope. But as we'll see, I think that Belloc's, as you've pointed out, Belloc's republicanism and this admiration for the French Revolution is based upon this Romanitas, this admiration for the mixed regime of the Roman Principate and the admiration for democracy. And we can get into that. And I think that, he does have some justification in some ways for that. I'm not a great admirer of so-called absolutist monarchy. And there were all sorts of, very widespread pathologies at work in 18th century Ancien Regime France. So we can discuss that. But I think, just holding on to that idea of his French nationalism, how it colored things. Maybe later we can get into the thought of Boulainvilliers and how Belloc really had this very strong, again, during the First World War, particularly shrill Germanophobia, which also, I think, lies behind his enthusiasm for the French Revolution, because I think he accepted Boulainvilliers' historical sociology that the second estate of the Ancien Regime were basically Germans, the Franks. And the French Revolution was this sort of inchoate uprising of the Romano-Gallic third estate, overthrowing these barbarian interlopers. So yeah, we can get more into that later as well.
Indeed, and that was what I was alluding to by the Gallican Republic, as opposed to the French Republic. The idea that there was this intentional process of ethnically othering the aristocracy, which, of course, as you've referenced there, is the second estate. But again, this is a rather prophetic passage, because again, it could be applied equally to Belloc's time from de Maistre, and this is the last segment I'm going to be reading from de Maistre. And at the end, I'm going to buttress it with, I would say, comparing de Maistre's views and actually how they could be compatible with that notion of Romanitas that you brought up. The French nation does not want this government, being the Republic. And he was writing this in 1797, so this is during the time of the Directory, which I think virtually every historian recognizes as a government that no one really wanted, but was just is seen with the light of hindsight as a prelude towards the consulate in the empire, but suffers it and remains submissive, either because it cannot choke it off or because it fears something worse. The apologists of the Republic do not try to demonstrate its worthiness. These people will admit that the revolution that created the present government was a crime, provided that you grant them, it is unnecessary to make a new government. They beg the French nation to preserve the republic. And the reason I take that segment is that obviously that is the perspective of certain Catholic apologists in 1797 who were worried. This is after actually during aspects of the war in the Vendée, and the notion that there was this imminent, perhaps, return of the Duke of Provence to reclaim his throne. However, that any serious monarchist activity will result in a hard crackdown by the French authorities, such as what we saw with the war in the Vendée. And therefore, such attempts should be resisted, even though the Republic itself seemed to be on shaky ground. I have presented views on the white flag crisis of 1873 and how the Third Republic wasn't really entrenched in its position up until the separation of church and state under Emile Combes in 1905. And so, especially with the Ralliement, like we see with the Directory, it does seem rather premature to accept this unmoored state of affairs, this Republican Constitution of France, as a fait accompli. But again, there's this notion of fearing that anything that will come from it could result in a great moral and national calamity. But again, emphasis that it is the crime that creates the present government. The same thing is also applicable for the Third Republic. As you are well aware, the Third Republic came into being because the National Assembly of France usurped the authority of Napoleon III, who had been captured at Sedan. They usurped the authority of his potential successor, which was the Prince Imperial. And then, ironically, despite being a monarchist majority, Adolphe Thiers usurped the authority of the National Assembly and accrued power towards himself before ultimately he was replaced by MacMahon in 1873. So many aspects you can say of usurpation. And again, you can say the final usurpation comes with the expulsions of the royal houses of France in the 1880s following the death of the Comte de Chambord. But it does seem rather prescient, isn't it, that the same arguments applied to the Directory can also be applied to France in the late 19th century.
Yeah, I think that's an important parallel to draw. And what I'd be interested to hear your research here, AM. But what I was able to find on on Belloc's views on the Ralliement are just oblique references, where he wasn't as fulsomely critical as other French Catholic authors at the time of Leo XIII's call in Des Milieux solicitude for French Catholics to rally to the French Third Republic. But in the French Revolution, the Belloc's treatment of the revolution, in the final chapters, he talks about how Catholics were urged to recognize as final a settlement which was avowedly founded upon principles hostile to them. The result was not reconciliation, but disaster. So he's writing that in 1911, when the fruits of the Ralliement, the bitter fruits, are quite clear. I don't know what his position was at the time, but there he was being critical of it. So there is a real incoherence, it seems to me, with regard to Belloc's understanding of the republicanism in his own time, which has actually been called for by the Roman pontiff, and then the republicanism in the period of the late 18th century into the early 19th century, which was denounced by the popes and which he was enthusiastic about. So it's quite strange.
Indeed, and you're completely correct. The frustrating thing about researching this topic are the rather oblique references. The conclusion of the biographer who I've mentioned, Pierce, suggests that he embraced the cause of the Ralliement, or rather it was preferential to him because it aligned with his Republican leanings. The anecdote, which I read out at the beginning, which comes from the cruise to the Nona, was from the age of 22. So that was the same year as the Ralliement, 1892. So his Republican leanings were as established as right from the beginning of his intellectual development. In the same way, tracing friction or potential contradictions in that notion, his republicanism was in full force when he wrote The Path to Rome. When he wrote when we have several re-editions of The Path to Rome, so that quote was actually in his own personal recollections in 1908 regarding the high stoicism of the republics, that is after the separation of church and state. And even in Louis XIV, which has often been cited as the work which perhaps tended towards his sympathies towards monarchism, that was written in 1938, and he still refers to the revolution not as a crime but a misfire. So again, it's very difficult to trace. There is not a single sort of statement in Belloc where I find where he rebutes the notion of the republic in principle. And what I find fascinating, we're going to get to his. I'm going to cite certain examples from the final segment of his French Revolution from 1911. But what we see in that work is affirmation for Catholic republicanism. We never see a point from Belloc where he is denouncing republicanism. All we can take are these various oblique references and contextualize them within not just his own works, but within the context of France at that time. So it should also be mentioned that Belloc obviously was brought up in England. His mother was a suffragette, and he very soon, it should be mentioned, upon sort of becoming politically aware, becomes an anti-suffragette. So on the one hand, you would say his upbringing would lend itself to a certain political leaning, but it does not. Yet he was also a Liberal member of Parliament from 1906 to 1910. And this wasn't just any Liberal government, it should be mentioned, within the context of England and overall sort of British history. This is the Campbell Bannerman Asquith government. This is the government that brings in sweeping social legislation. And he stands for re-election again in 1910. So he didn't make his break from party politics. And then later, when he refuses to stand for re-election during the height of the parliamentary crisis of late 1910, early 1911, it's only then that he writes his book alongside G.K. Chesterton, The Party System, where he makes his break from the whole notion, you can say, of the Westminster system of government, and declares it was basically nothing more than a shadow plutocracy, albeit his assessment of various parliamentary systems as a variance. So, for example, in the party system, I believe the issue is I can't actually quite remember necessarily where exactly I've read them, because I've sort of half read and fully read about 20 sources for Belloc sort of coming into this conversation. But I believe it was in the party system, he was looking at the French Third Republic favorably compared to the British parliamentary system, because he believed that the whole nature of the government side and the opposition, essentially in the British system, you have the government party benches, and then you have His Majesty's most loyal opposition. And Belloc believed that that took away from the fundamental representative functions of a parliamentary system. And so he looked to the French Third Republic and believed that the cohabitation of so many different blocs and political parties with their own representatives from each of the departments was actually more conducive towards quote unquote representative democracy. Yet this is also with the caveat that he ultimately came to lose faith in all forms, you can say, of representative democracy. So every point I'm making can have an asterisk next to it. So, but I think I've gone sort of far too long in that point. But needless to say, that de Maistre criticism was as relevant back in the 1790s as it was in the 1890s. Frenchmen. It was the noise of hellish songs, the blasphemy of atheism, the cries of death, and the prolonged moans of slaughtered innocents. It was by the light of the flames, on the debris of throne and altar, watered by the blood of the best of kings and an innumerable host of other victims. It was contempt of morality and the established faith. It was in the midst of very crime that your seducers and your tyrants founded what they call your liberty. It will be in the name of the very good and the very great God, in the train of men whom he loves and inspires, and under his influence of his creative power, that you will return to your old constitution, and that a king will give you the only thing that you ought wisely to desire, liberty through the monarchy. And this is very interesting, because not only is it doubling down on that aspect, that the revolution was contempt of the established faith, that being Catholicism, and by extension a crime, but also a crime against liberty. To really buttress your comment about Romanitas, de Maistre, his own philosophy of monarchism is harmony between the estates, putting it very simply. So harmony between the Catholic Church, the first estate, the nobility, the second estate, and the third estate, which by the time that we have Adolphe, the Abbé Sieyès and his famous pamphlet on the third estate, it had not come to mean that in the context of medieval Europe. When we're talking about the precedents of various 14th century burgeoning parliamentary institutions, and of course going back to the quote-unquote model parliament of Edward Longshanks, we're talking about political systems which are allowing for limited representation. So before the Great Reform Act in England in 1832, roughly only, to sort of put it very sort of approximately, 5% of the population could vote. Many of the constituencies were rotten boroughs, but the point is that you have representatives from the legal professions, from the cities, most importantly. In Germany, these are called the Bürgerliche. Within France, this becomes the bourgeoisie. It is the urban dwelling notables that represent the third estate more broadly, and this was the case within medieval constitutions. When de Maistre is looking at this, you can say that it is the general estates, as established in 1789, that in theory would produce that form of medieval government that de Maistre would essentially look on fondly. And because all of these institutions are looking towards ancient legal precedents, therefore you can say that the whole premise, you can say, that separates modern forms of democracy from more quote-unquote medieval forms of government is that democracy contrives legislation, whereas older forms of government try to reify existing legal precedents. So liberty is contained within the ancients rather than something invented as a result of a scrap of paper. But also you mentioned the influence of the Principate. And this essentially could be equally applied to the Augustinian form of government. Indeed, I've made a rather contentious claim elsewhere, Theo, that you could look at Augustus as the greatest monarch who ever lived for that exact reason, because Augustus, not only is he able to bring a balance and to restore, you can say, the peace of the quote-unquote Roman Principate, the newly rejigged Roman Republic, res publica Romana, Pax Romana, but he is also able to facilitate, you can say, the link between the imperator, the monarch, as tribune of the plebs, representing what would essentially be the medieval equivalent of the third estate, whilst also reifying the institution of the Senate by allowing senators to participate in the functions and offices of government without essentially suffering from the ruinous and potentially fatal effects of political participation before Augustus. And someone is mentioning regarding medieval systems, also the guild system, obviously. So there is a way that de Maistre can reconcile Romanitas to medievalism. But a factor of Belloc, I believe, and a factor of the French Revolutionaries is that they did not see that connection. And therefore, when they were looking to figures like Rousseau and the wisdom of the ancients, they believed, as with your point of essentially ostracizing the second estate, that part of retrieving the Gallican Mediterranean institutions was also a process of returning to Rome and returning to the pure Stoic existence, if we're going to use a word of Belloc, from those republican institutions that we saw potentially under Augustus. But I would also claim that the high sort of water point of the Roman Republic was around about the 5th to the 4th centuries BC.
Like many Frenchmen of his generation, in fact, European men in general, Belloc had this sort of wildly, overly rosy-eyed view, overly optimistic view of the classical world, and that is that's obviously informing his view here, and this desire to sort of excavate this monarchical republicanism, this meritocratic monarchy that he envisages as the ideal state, infused by divine grace and by divine revelation. But what Belloc gets most wrong, for me, his gravest error in all of this, actually something that I think really is very, very problematic, is that he makes the conflation, which is of course so common, one encounters it very often among Americans today, of thinking that his admiration for democracy as a form of regime is what his preferential advocacy there is tied to the errors of liberalism, whereas these are two different things. And I think there's the lack of making a distinction there. That he's perfectly free to extol democracy. There's plenty within the Catholic tradition to support that. Leo the Great, when talking about why the laity should have a role in electing bishops, said, he who governs all ought to be chosen by all. And in fact, if you look at the Middle Ages, the genesis of representative democracy was the Catholic Church. The transposition of the democratic principles of ecumenical councils and of religious orders, which served as models for nascent national parliaments in the Middle Ages. I've written about this, about how the Dominican order, the order of preachers, served as the model for the first convocations of the Houses of Parliament. But he then elides that with these condemned principles of liberalism, which as I say, is just downright concerning. So the very first paragraph of his book, The French Revolution, reads, quote, "The political theory upon which the revolution proceeded has, especially in this country, the United Kingdom, suffered ridicule as local, as ephemeral, and as fallacious. It is universal, it is eternal, and it is true." End quote. And he talks about, as a Catholic, how he is strongly attached to the political theory of the revolution. Well, by that, he doesn't just mean democracy, because the next chapter is about Rousseau's social contract, and we can get into that. But Belloc actually gives affirmation and approval of the two condemned central principles of liberalism, which are popular sovereignty, national sovereignty, popular sovereignty, the revolutionary account of political authority and where it resides, where it comes from, and secondly, of now let me just recall that freedom of religion. Now, not that Belloc freely promotes that in the same way that he does with regard to popular sovereignty, but that is what was promoted from the very outset of the French Revolution. So you get some Catholics who say, well, we abhor the radicalization, the radical phase, the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution, the Republican phase from 1792 onwards, but we support and we affirm the noble pursuits of the constitutional monarchy in the initial phase of the French Revolution. However, one of the very first acts of the National Assembly is the promulgation of religious liberty, which is condemned as well. That's the sort of Voltairean phase of the French Revolution, and that is irreconcilable with the Catholic tradition. So with regards to the former, in 1881, De Aeternum Illud, an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, Belloc would have been familiar. Leo writes, "Those men of more recent times, late 19th century, walking in the footsteps of those who in a former age assumed to themselves the name of philosophers, philosophe, say that all power comes from the people, so that those who exercise it in the state do so not as their own, but as delegated to them by the people, and that by this rule it can be revoked by the will of the very people by whom it was delegated. But from these Catholics dissent, who affirm that the right to rule is from God, as from a natural and necessary principle. It is of importance, however, to remark in this place that those who may be placed over the state may in certain cases be chosen by the will and decision of the multitude, democracy, without opposition to or impugning of the Catholic doctrine. And by this choice, in truth, the ruler is designated, but the rights of ruling are not thereby conferred, nor is the authority delegated to him, but the person by whom it is to be exercised is determined upon. There is no question here respecting forms of government, for there is no reason why the church should not approve of the chief power being held by one man or by more, provided only it be just and that it tend to the common good, end quote. So this is the most serious, as I say, of Belloc's errors, to say that the political theory upon which the revolution proceeded is universal, it is true, and it is eternal. Leo explicitly condemns this, and there isn't really the recognition of that, as far as I've been able to find in Belloc, of the revolutionary formulation as condemned, or of this false idea of the Rousseauian general will, which Belloc seems to try and synthesize with his appreciation of medieval representative systems, which is laudable.
So thank you, Theo. I'm going to read out a segment which I think further buttresses your points before we get into what you could say is the main sort of thrust, which is regarding the civil constitution of the clergy. But we are very lucky to be joined by Charles Coulomb. Hello.
Hello. Sorry to be late. I'm afraid that a Burns night supper and getting up early and then coming back and making the mistake of sitting down in that chair right there, lethal combination.
So you haven't, unfortunately, you haven't been on this channel for a long time. So some of the people watching aren't necessarily aware of who you are. So as the illustrious person that you are, Charles, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, surely. I'm Charles Coulomb. I've written a number of books, a number of articles. My major interests, of course, are the church, the state, monarchy, folklore, culture. I suppose you have to say I'm kind of a Catholic generalist.
So thank you. Again, just to sort of reiterate the sort of framework for this discussion, again, as Theo was doing explicitly in his passage there, it's about trying to understand Belloc's overall position regarding republicanism, however oblique and in some cases contradictory, and how to reconcile that with what you can say to be the pervading monarchism of Catholics at the time of the Ralliement, and how his position was in some cases, you can say, revolutionary by the very fact that he seemed to embrace the very republicanism before we even see aspects such as the separation of church and state in 1905. This is before Catholic Christian democracy becomes a ubiquitous notion by the 1940s. So stating that, I really, because you focus on something very important there, Theo, which is on reconciling the Rousseauian national will, but how does he believe that's practical? Now, in 1925, Belloc goes over to Italy and he has a private audience with Mussolini. And he looks at Mussolini as this great, decisive, severe man. In many aspects, Belloc actually believes that he can typify this stoic republicanism. And it's important to see that Mussolini was a republican. I've done a presentation where I go into how essentially Mussolini was able to reconcile himself to a monarchical form of government. I allude to various facts about their sort of general antipathy of a certain sort of a Catholic order within the sort of more socialistic aspects of fascism before we get to the Lateran Treaty. But it's during this conversation that this is at the same time that Mussolini is consolidating his control and essentially usurping and ultimately overriding the quote-unquote democratic institutions of the Kingdom of Italy, and by extension also sequestering and isolating the king, Vittorio Emanuele III. And to Belloc, he presents the idea of democratic majorities or general wills as a nonsense, and he, as the totalitarian that he is, Mussolini, believes that all people should be part of the party which is also emblematic of the state, being the fascist party. So against this is a time for Belloc to really elucidate on his ideas of what the national will and what majority rule really is. And this is from a segment taken from the Cruise of the Nona. The right of a majority to rule is, indeed, an absurd doctrine, as we hear it commonly stated, again reaffirming Belloc's rather tragic association with republics as practiced. I do not mean the doctrine of majority government under what is called the representative system, for that is not the majority government at all. It is mere oligarchy in the hands of an intriguing caucus, and perhaps at base a form of oligarchy as mankind has ever tolerated, again referring back to his role in the Liberal Party from 1906 to 1910, and his authorship alongside Chesterton of the party system. I mean real majority government, the reference of a question to the body of the governed, and the taking of a decision according to the superior number of votes recorded on the yes or the no side. Such a test, used as the universal decider, is ridiculous. What would a majority vote do with bimetallism or the appointment of admirals? But there are conditions in which a decision by a majority is just, and they are surely these: when the question arises from a homogeneous community. And again, Theo, that just reaffirms the point that his patriotic French republicanism is Gallican. He views this as part of there's an ethnic necessity to maintain a homogeneous unit, which he goes on to reaffirm. When there is an active popular demand for its settlement, again, the notion on the popular will, when the matter on discussion is reasonably familiar to all. And again, it's this notion of passive and active citizens. He believed that there is an incumbent responsibility on people to become politically involved. And this is why his tragic association with republicanism tends to focus on the need for the small republic rather than the great republic. When it concerns all, or nearly all directly, and in much the same degree, and when the majority is substantial, you must be dealing with an homogeneous community. For one made up of various races or fundamentally different religions, a majority means nothing towards a decision, again reaffirming that idea of a homogeneous national community. It is a mere affirmation of discord. You must have a real and popular demand for a decision, and it must proceed from the people themselves, not from a body claiming to frame the right of the question. A vote on matters of no popular interest, as a vote, say, for example, on Welsh disestablishment in North London or mining regulations in Brighton, is a manifest abuse, again referring back to his role in Parliament. Even a burning matter discussed by, known to, and affecting all, no small majority can possibly be decisive or make an accord for a half, is not the general will. But when a community of one stuff votes by a large majority in favor of something they both understand and desire, and that's something close to their own lives, then the majority is of true effect. Under those conditions, the moral argument for the majority government seems to me unanswerable. For under those conditions, you have the will of the community really expressed by the majority. Now, the community is ultimately sovereign, and as we'll get into, and I'll come to the end of this segment, and I'll allow for your views on that. The idea of the community is ultimately sovereign, again, is completely at variance with the monarchist contention here, and again reaffirming this idea of the Rousseauian national will. For if the community be not sovereign, what else can claim sovereignty? It is the old dilemma of Suarez, the great Jesuit doctrine, as absolutely secure as a mathematical conclusion. Ultimately, the community is sovereign, but unless these conditions are present, and unless all of them are present, the majority is not the community, and to call it so is either a delusion or a trick. It is also immoral, usually fatuous, and occasionally disastrous. And again, it's important writing this far beyond the sort of time scope of the French Revolution. This is in the 1920s, so when he is sort of firmly ensconced in his sort of political proclivities and opinions. But I want to sort of open that sort of point up discussion to everyone else, because I've been speaking for a very long time. Perhaps you, Charles.
Well, I think one of the key things you've got to bear in mind about Belloc, and I say this because he and I have certain, shall we say, similarities, in the sense they were both Franco-English, Anglo-French. And believe me when I tell you, that creates a very particular point of view. And normally I am the first to avoid the ad hominem. Time after time, you'll hear me say, if you've got to go ad hominem, you've lost it. But I do think that to understand Belloc, we have to understand that he was a relative of Danton, the great French revolutionary. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because to a Frenchman, family is everything. I'm very fortunate that there were no Protestants or liberals in my family of any note, because I would have to spend the rest of my career defending them. And this is a very particular thing that has to be understood. If you read Belloc's letters, you can see very much how his mind functions in this area. That Danton, of all the revolutionaries, had to be the one who was right. He rejected, of course, the Jacobins, but the Girondins, they were the good guys, obviously. So I bring that up simply because it colors an awful lot of what he has to say about French history.
And it's very important, and I like the idea that again, this is perhaps a fundamental defect of the French in terms of understanding this, that he has some sort of familial obligation to steelman his ancestor in that regard. But you're correct, because what is the first major historical work he publishes? It is a study of Danton. Exactly. In 1899. And I've always found this baffling, because I think many of us come to Hilaire Belloc through a certain sort of a certain prism. So I come to him through his monarchist writings, and thereby I find it all the more interesting when sort of delving deeper, that when coming, say, for example, to his work on Robespierre, which was the sort of first sympathetic portrayal I've seen of him of a figure from the French Revolution, I found his sympathy for Robespierre rather remarkable. But when it comes to Danton, I find it baffling.
Right. It's not, when you realize they were related. And the other thing is that because of this, his view of French history was far less impartial than his view of English history. And that's why, frankly, I rely on him quite a bit in terms of English history. One of the things I found very, very fascinating when the stripping of the altars was published. There's several kinds of historians, and Belloc was very much an intuitive historian. He engaged his imagination, and he very often came to the right conclusion about particular times and places because he had a very fine historical intuition. But he was not the sort of historian who spends decades poring over documents and then publishes his findings. That's a much more painstaking kind of history. Not always as exciting either to write or to read. But what I thought was interesting was how his writings about the Reformation were so fully endorsed by the stripping of the altars, which is the work of a very fine historian of the latter type, and was able, very often Belloc was not able to back up with chapter and verse his historical conclusions regarding British history. But here you have, dealing specifically with the Reformation, here you have a man backing up Belloc's every conclusion with the most incredibly painstaking primary source work. And again, that, we all have our limitations. We all have our strong points. And Belloc's strong point was definitely English history, because he could apply that fine intellect of his to something without any prior prejudice, really.
It's rather interesting. Sorry, continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I was just going to say, on a very, very deep level, it sort of didn't matter for Belloc which side was right or wrong in English history. All he really wanted to do was get to the facts. He wasn't trying to prove anything. But with French history, he's got something to prove. And, anyone who sets out to prove something historically, generally speaking, they can prove it. If that's what you're out to do, you can prove almost anything historically. All you have to do is carefully arrange your facts and not notice the ones you don't want to. And this is often an unconscious process, by the way. I don't mean to say he was sitting there, gee, is this going to make Danton look bad? No, it's an unconscious thing. I also have to bear in mind too that he had lived through the results of the Ralliement. He had seen them, and it was a pretty horrific time, because you've got to basically understand what Leo XIII was doing. Practically speaking, I'm not talking about the theoretical or theological aspects, but basically he was asking the cream of the French Catholic community to choose between the church and the king. That is not a choice that they should ever have been, or anyone should ever have to make. Not if the king isn't Henry VIII. That should not be a choice that you have to make. I love Leo XIII, but I think the Ralliement was one of his two greatest mistakes.
And I would like really Theo to come in, because you've done a exquisite presentation over on your channel, the Two Cities podcast, regarding aspects of the Ralliement, because I really want to touch on what you brought up regarding Danton, because I think it's very indicative and fundamental to understand this notion of Belloc's republicanism. But again, for the sake of the audience, Theo, would you like to give us some context regarding the Ralliement? I just want to also point out regarding the mistake, I think, again, what you also brought up in that presentation is the unequivocal stand against the Italian monarchy, re Mussolini, and the prisoner in the Vatican, versus the Ralliement to the French Republic in the 1890s.
Yes, I was just reading a story the other day. Charles might be familiar of a Carlist general in the year 1900 who was being urged by a priest from Rome to recognize the Alphonsine monarchy. And he said, I'll recognize the Alphonsine monarchy when the Pope recognizes the House of Savoy. So there was a double standard there. And just one point actually on Belloc's main error, as far as I see it, on popular sovereignty. I think there's a real lesson to be extracted here, which is the danger of using inherently revolutionary language and terminology uncritically. So I would contend that sovereignty is itself a revolutionary notion, given that it comes to us from Jean Bodin, so another French thinker that perhaps Belloc is uncritically accepting, this notion of undivided sovereignty. And so I think, part of this confusion emerges in his thoughts because he's using language which was first introduced into Christian political philosophical discourse by revolutionaries, enemies of the high medieval Catholic political philosophy. So if Belloc had said, I mean by popular sovereignty, I mean that political authority is held in a kind of trust for the common good and it's not the private property of rulers, that's absolutely fine. But the way in which he takes Rousseau and then, as I've said earlier, uncritically presents his thought as not contrary to the church's political philosophy, that's very problematic. And I think it arises, I say, because he's doing things like taking this terminology of sovereignty at face value, which is a dangerous thing to do.
Can I quickly belabor that point regarding Jean Bodin, because I think that's key. Jean Bodin was writing during the French Wars of Religion, and I also believe that's fundamental to understanding Belloc's own views of the causes of the French Revolution, the religious causes of the French Revolution. And in my view, Bodin has always been an antecedent towards Thomas Hobbes. The idea, again, that there is a national sovereignty and there has to be a religious accord, and by implication, there is some aspect of freedom of religion, and that the sovereign power is responsible for imposing harmony among the warring religious factions. Of course, during the French Wars of Religion, you start off with the Protestants trying to claim the monarch. And then after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, we have the arrival of the monarchamax fighting against the monarchy, which is also sort of spread over with the Calvinist revolution in the Netherlands, which also affects France, is basically the co-religionists. And we see the same language being used against Philip II. So you can see the origins and a lot of, you can say, the contentious aspects of Belloc's thought within the period of the Reformation and the Wars of Religion.
Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, there is an interesting example of French Catholic republicanism there, which perhaps inspired Belloc. I'll be interested to hear from you, gentlemen, whether you've found anything in your reading about Belloc's thoughts on some of the political constitutional proposals of the Catholic League at the end of the French Wars of Religion, perhaps as a model that he was considering. But yeah, to take Bodin's idea of sovereignty, that, as you said, sovereign is the one who depends on the power of his sword, and that it's unqualified before law. It's throwing off the medieval understanding that the king is God's lieutenant, sub deo et lege, under God and law. I think that leads to all these kind of problems, and there's a lesson there that we should take about using this revolutionary terminology, because it upsets all the categories of classical and Christian thought which we should be basing our political philosophy on. But just to go back to one of our interpretive keys for Belloc, for him, it seems that the real enemy is always the oligarchic few against the moral majority. And I think, what you said earlier about his ideals regarding this sort of Gallic democratic overthrow of these Germanic oligarchical elites in the French Revolution, I think, are really undergirded by that. But by the time of the Ralliement, you asked for a little bit of context there. I can add more depending on where you want to take it, but it led to, as Charles said, a really bitter divide among French Catholics, and there continues to be a debate of whether the Ralliement itself was what caused the rapid dissolution of the French Church's position in the Third Republic, or whether it was the intransigence of the French royalists who carried out a sort of spoiling action and failed to embrace the cause of Christian democracy that led to this loss of political power for Catholics. But I would argue that it was more the mistaken conception of the Ralliement itself, which, again, like Belloc, I think, although Belloc recognized it in the case of Ralliement, but weirdly not in the case of the First Republic, the problem is not calling Catholics to accept the possibility of democracy as a political form, but embracing the republic, which itself is built upon anti-Catholic principles, chiefly, as I say, religious liberty and the idea of national sovereignty.
And this is after sort of Léon Gambetta. This is after the adoption of La Marseillaise as the anthem of the new republic. This isn't, say, for example, in the 1870s, where there is a potential, essentially, that the republic can become more Catholic in its character. Those elements essentially have been overridden and superseded. And of course, it's going to really culminate with the the great cause célèbre of the 1890s and early 20th century, which of course is the Dreyfus affair. So thank you for providing that context. I'm trying to sort of juggle in my brain elements that Charles has brought up and elements that that you have brought up, Theo. But I think Charles was alluding to the whole sort of patriotic nature of Belloc's view of French history and how he wasn't this historian who goes along and spends decades researching a particular topic. As we all know, Belloc is incredibly, almost unbelievably prolific. With the introduction to his study of Robespierre, it should be mentioned that Belloc claimed to have researched the topic for 2 years. So he was very considerate in the sense that he believed he was being as exhaustive in terms of his appreciation of the sources as he could be. But it is alluding to what I believe is a primary influence, and this isn't an original remark, which is that Belloc and his understanding of the French Revolution, I think it's inescapable, is indebted to the legacy of Thomas Carlyle. In the 1930s, Belloc, in fact, wrote an introduction to a new edition of Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution. And in that introduction, he declared that the revolution was the product of a Catholic nation, of a nation that is, with a contempt for fatalism and adherence to abstract dogmas and a military hatred of mere force and of the religions of fear. Really, it seems interesting that among the many sort of secular influences of Belloc, that Thomas Carlyle will be one of them, being essentially a pseudo or sort of lapsed Calvinist theist that he was. But if you, say, for example, look to Sartor Resartus or Past and Present, and of course the French Revolution itself, which, if I recall correctly, was written in 1841, I believe it informs so much of the thrust and phraseology of, say, for example, his work on Danton. When he refers to Danton, he is basically trying to create a sketch of someone who is musing around and believes that the Republic is the manifestation, essentially, of this subconscious general will of the momentum of the revolution. In fact, ironically, it's de Maistre, in his considerations of France, that believes that the French Revolution took on a momentum of its own. And his fascination with Danton, Belloc's, is that he believed Danton was in many ways a microcosm of that tendency towards republic. And in his study of Robespierre, there's another very revealing quote from Belloc. At the time of the French Revolution, the creative genius of France tended towards republic. And again, if there's some sort of a Carlylean notion about history having a momentum, having a creative energy in its own right, and again, that's the beginning sort of quote of Sartor Resartus, "To time I am heir." Nothing can, say, for example, better exhibit that in his sympathies towards the persons of the French Revolution than the creative genius of France tending towards republic. He could be referring to not just Robespierre in that instance, but to Danton. He's very laudatory of Condorcet, for example. Even figures who are, I think any sort of Catholic hearing this would have to really scratch their heads. Couthon and Saint-Just as well. How can someone show sympathy towards Louis XVI and also probably the most polemical of all the regicides, Saint-Just, at the same time? But if anything, again, it is a microcosm of all of these seeming contradictions. But again, to give Belloc the benefit of the doubt, it's something also that Michelet, who is another very prominent influence on Belloc, believes that the past and the process of history is a resurrection. Going to Collingwood, who is a historian in England who is a contemporary of Belloc, he believes that history is a process of reenactment, again, echoing those sentiments of Michelet. And so when he looks at Robespierre in his study, or he looks at the various figures of the French Revolution written in 1911, he seems again very conscious of the fact that he is not placing upon his work this, again, as you mentioned, Charles, this genealogical bias towards these figures. He believes that it's his responsibility to have as much sympathy for his historical subject in order to act as that reanimating process. And by that same token, his sympathy comes across for all of the figures of the revolution, whether it be Lafayette, whether it be Danton, whether it be Mirabeau. Again, that seems to be a remarkable feature, that individually, all these figures within the French Revolution would seem to contradict each other, and yet Belloc tries to take them and place them as a cohesive whole within his works in the French Revolution. So yes, that's just me trying to sort of gauge his understanding regarding his approach towards the works in the French Revolution, but I'd like to get your thoughts.
Well, I do think that Belloc was affected, as really every Catholic historian or thinker in the English-speaking world has to a certain degree. There's a certain element of always having to try to square the circle, of always having to try to make sense out of situations that are perhaps not easily made sense of. For example, in the United States, the revolution, the American Revolution, is very much our founding myth. Now, the problem for the American Catholic, for the American, you're supposed to see it in a sort of providential light as almost a divine occurrence. With the subsequent bringing of the Constitution by the Holy Ghost. The problem for the Catholic who studies it is that while there were Catholic figures prominent on the revolutionary side, most notably Charles Carroll of Carleton, in its beginning, it was very much an anti-Catholic enterprise. The Quebec Act, prior to that, George III allowing Bishop Briand, in the face of the opposition of his own government, to be consecrated a bishop in France. You're stuck with a lot of issues that are not, shall we say, easily reconciled. And you see that in Catholic English historiography as well, because in the 19th century, most Catholics joined the Liberal Party, the heirs of the Whigs, and were the opponents of the Tories, who were the heirs of what had been the Catholic Party. How do you square the circle? How do you reconcile these things? How do you reconcile what I'm doing at the moment with the theory I believe I should hold? Well, what you do are any number of series of mental gymnastics, varying according to the writer of the person. That's what you do. And in the case of Belloc, he applied the same sort of, although he was much more coherent with English history, as I've said, he attempted to apply the same sort of gymnastics to French history. I mean, even the phrase you quote about the genius of France and all that, I don't know what kind of an historical quote that is. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it would be up there, and mind you, we do this all the time in American history, so it's not like I'm not familiar with it. You know, the genius of the American people has always been ... Really? That's great. I don't know what it means, but it's wonderful. But you get used to thinking in this mode. You know, it's not like you don't really believe it. It's very real to you. But because it's real to you, doesn't necessarily mean it's objectively true. Although it does mean that you're not being insincere.
I don't think I'm ever sort of implying that I actually doubt his sincerity. I think what is remarkable about his, I'm more inclined, obviously, as I already alluded to, his study of Robespierre over Danton. I believe I disagree with almost all of the conclusions he reaches towards in Danton, but again, from someone who has always looked at Robespierre as someone who is fundamentally incompatible with the tragic notion of human nature, that again is very much Belloc's approach. Where I disagree with him vehemently is over his apologetics of Robespierre as not being responsible for the terror, and instead places it on figures such as Fouché and Carnot, and to a lesser extent Saint-Just, and that hasn't really been corroborated by later historiography that places the burden of the blame mainly on Robespierre. So again, it's very interesting to take all of these considerations in mind. This comes to again, I was talking to Theo earlier. Actually, no, before I get to that point, I want to address what you just brought up, Charles, about the Republic. And sorry to everyone if I'm going back and forth. There are a lot of ideas to juggle simultaneously. But what I find so, you can almost say, contentious, if not preposterous, about Belloc is that by the time of the 1890s, especially after Lincoln and the American Civil War, you can understand why there is that deification of the revolution within popular memory, if not necessarily most historiography. That is understandable. But I think Belloc is exhibiting this tendency, like I said, just to sum up to a form of summation of his opinion, the creative genius of France, towards an incredibly contentious program where most of his co-religionists are monarchists, and when most of the 19th century has been a succession of Catholic governments with various degrees of sincerity. So, for example, Charles X, perhaps being the most obvious case, but also Napoleon III, who, I mean, Belloc and his life spans the entire time, you can say, of the French Third and Fourth Republics, but also Vichy France, it should be mentioned. So he doesn't have that experience, that direct experience with any of these Catholic monarchical regimes. But given again the fact that Napoleon III was, along with the papal Zouaves, who take their name from their association with imperial France, were there preventing the Savoyard monarchy from taking Rome and protecting the temporal possession of the Pope. The idea again that Belloc will be justified in identifying these American sympathies towards Republic and his own position seems, like I said, it seems incredibly contentious. I don't think you can justify it from that perspective, especially at that time.
No, I'd agree.
Just before you joined, Charles, the two Englishmen on this stream were roundly criticizing the French propensity to invoke Gallic pride. So, yeah, I think what you just said there is particularly worth underlining.
Well, mind you, I have to accept the fact there's an awful lot to be proud of. But that being said, it is a funny thing too. You've got to bear in mind that Belloc, I go back to his Anglo-French nature. That duality affected him in an awful lot of ways. You know, it's interesting. His French was not very good. It was sort of Burgundian dialect peppered with army slang. And on a couple of occasions, he had to give a lecture in France. And it was horrible. It was really horrible. And I know because I've had to do the same thing. And believe me, limping along in Canadian French, when you sound like a hick in your own ears, and you can see people are trying to be polite, but it's difficult. You know, they say the British are snobs when it comes to accents and so forth. Believe me, they're egalitarian compared to the French, without a doubt. And I say this with nothing but love for France, but it's the way it is. I mention this because he once met Maistre. I don't know if you know the story. There's the great theorist, of course, of L'accent français and all that. And where Belloc was a pro-revolutionary Catholic. At the time, Maistre was an anti-revolutionary, pro-Catholic non-believer. So there was kind of a creative tension there. But between Belloc's dialect and Maistre's deafness, they couldn't understand each other at all. It was almost a pointless exercise. But no, I think that the whole notion of Catholic republicanism has always been an argument from theory, because it can't really be an argument from history. We have yet to see a stable, long-lived Catholic republic.
Just to steelman the position, I think this is actually tending towards what you and I brought up earlier, Theo, about Romanitas and the monarchical republic. But the main example I would cite against this, but it's worth noting, so I'm sure someone will comment about this, would be the Venetian Republic.
And the Venetian Republic would hardly count as a republic under our terms. For one thing, they themselves held themselves to be part of a larger monarchical entity. That its origins were as Byzantine feudatories against the barbarians, and they retained some sort of vague connection with the empire. And they're a very small example in any case. Venice, despite its best efforts and partial success, it was a small country. And its monarchy really was an oligarchy. Well, certainly, or an aristocracy, if you will. It was hardly a republic in modern terms. Even the title of its head of state, Doge, the fact that he could only be selected from a small number of patrician families, this is not what we think of as republicanism. Otherwise, you could cite Genoa and a lot of other Italian city-states. But there again, you could also, during the same period, you've got the Swiss cantons, you've got the, up in Dithmarschen, you had a sort of peasant, quote-unquote, republic. But these were all smaller parts of a larger monarchical entity. The same with the imperial free cities. The same with the royal towns in France. They ran their own affairs, but ultimately they were subject to a monarch. So I repeat what I say. You simply do not have an historical example of what we would consider a Catholic republic lasting for more than a very few years.
I think I would, in terms of terminology, because those are very salient points, and we needed that sound bite for the sake of this conversation and the sake of objectivity. But I would emphasize democratic republic over res publica as meaning, say, for example, I look at Venice and I say it looks more like oligarchical Rome in its constitution than it does anything that we can possibly recognize today as a republic.
Yeah. And the truth of the matter also is that, again, we're like anybody anywhere, we're certainly conditioned by the times we live in. One of the reasons why the church, why Catholics anyway, have sought to find some sort of means of compromise with the modern world is because of a long series of defeats in the 19th and 20th centuries. And every now, eventually you get tired of it. You get tired of fighting what appears to be a battle you never win. So can we make some sort of a deal so we can get on with whatever it is we consider our business to be? I think you see that in the Ralliement, definitely. You see it in the softening of Leo XIII's condemnation of Americanism. I mean the heresy. I don't mean, being patriotic. It explains a lot about Vatican II, frankly, and the desire, for instance, on the part of the Council Fathers to see an organic difference between Anglo-American liberalism and continental liberalism. The great irony with Belloc was, in a sense, although from the opposite point of view, he showed that really they are the same thing. It's just a difference in degree, not in kind. The fathers of Vatican II were very much of the belief that you could have, and now I'm quoting Benedict XVI, a confessionally neutral state, nevertheless illumined by gospel values. Well, even less than a Catholic republic do we find any historical example of that sort of thing.
I think it's important. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say the closest you could come was, oddly enough, the United States at the time of Vatican II.
An argument could be made. It's interesting because you've mentioned the idea again, and it's quite convincing that a Catholic republic exists more in the theoretical realm than it does in terms of historical reality. And I've already alluded to this, the idea that Belloc was adamant that there was a theoretical underpinning for his Catholic republicanism. And also, Theo, you mentioned earlier about, and you, Charles, the idea that part of the errors of Belloc as a historian is that he was trying to form opinions around his topic more than he was simply aiming at, in Brankian terms, the pursuit of truth for its own sake. And I think it's no clearer than in the final segment of his French Revolution, where he asked the question, and this is probably the longest reading segment I have because I think it's the most pertinent in terms of finding all of these oblique references to the Catholic Republic. Was there a necessary and fundamental quarrel between the doctrines of the Revolution and those of the Catholic Church? And he goes on to explain. Those ill-acquainted with either party, and therefore ill-equipped for reply, commonly reply with assurance in the affirmative. The French, and still more the non-French Republican, who may happen by the accident of his life to have missed the Catholic Church, to have no intimacy with any Catholic character, no reading of Catholic philosophy, and perhaps even no chance view of so much as external Catholic ceremony, replies unhesitatingly that the Church is the necessary enemy of the Revolution. And that would actually buttress the point you were making earlier, Theo, about Simon Schama. Again, the emigre, the wealthy woman, the recluse, any one of the many contemporary types to whom the democratic theory of the Revolution came as a complete novelty, and today the wealthy families in the tradition reply as unhesitatingly that the Revolution is the necessary enemy of the Church. The reply seems quite sufficient to the Tory squire in England or Germany, who may happen to be a Catholic by birth or by conversion, and it seems equally obvious to, let us say, a democratic member of some Protestant church in one of the new countries. Well, going beyond his ad hominems, we'll get to his theoretical approach. Historically and logically, theologically also, those who affirm a necessary antagonism between the Republic and the Church are in error. Those who are best fitted to approach the problem by their knowledge both of what the Revolution attempted and of what Catholic philosophy is, find it, in proportion to their knowledge, difficult or impossible to answer the fundamental question in the affirmative. They cannot call the Revolution a necessary enemy of the Church, nor the Church of democracy. What is more, minds at most of the most active and of the best instructed sort are the very minds which find it difficult to explain how any such quarrel can have arisen. French history is itself full of the names of those for whom not so much a reconciliation between the Revolution and the Church as a statement that no real quarrel exists between them was the motive of politics, and almost in proportion to a man's knowledge of his fellows in Catholic societies, almost in that proportion is the prime question I have asked answered by such a man in the negative. A man who knows both the faith and the Republic will tell you that there is not and cannot be any necessary or fundamental reason why conflict should have arisen between a European democracy and the Catholic Church. We've gone into the various motivations, indeed his patriotism. Just a point before I get on, because it's important to read all of this to get the entire argument out there, before just criticizing that very sort of unquestioning, infraggable affirmation, is that it does seem that the more you look into it, his republicanism was patriotic. I read an anecdote, I believe it was in the Pierce biography, where he was asked about Englishmen in the 1920s being republic, and for the sake of the English constitution, they were all idiots. So again, his Gallicanism is very in evidence when it comes to this particular aspect.
He, I mean, also, again, I hate to descend to the ad hominem, but remember too that he had seen the wild about face that the Third Republic took during World War I for the Union Sacrée, where all of a sudden the church, the l'enfant that they wanted to erase in true Voltairean fashion, they suddenly realized they weren't going to be winning nothing without the cooperation of the Catholics of France. So all of a sudden, there's an Union Sacrée, which always reminded me a little bit of Stalin's embracing of orthodoxy during World War II. it was an expedient and not a particularly sincere one, a necessary one if they were going to win, of course. But as is always the case, the French who entered the Union Sacrée, the Catholics rather, that entered into it, did so wholeheartedly and sincerely.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, got nothing for it after the war was over.
Yeah.
It again, another historical motif. Catholics so often enter into these alliances, and they're the sincere ones. And when the crisis that provoked the alliance is over, they get nothing. Absolutely nothing. One of the great tragedies of American Catholic history is that during the Depression, in the 1930s, 30s, up to the beginning of World War II, the Catholic world, if you will, the activist Catholic world, was divided into three elements, really. For want of a better word, you could say the Coughlinites, the supporters of Father Coughlin, the sort of Catholic worker types around Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and the circle around the Right Reverend Monsignor John Ryan, who they call the Right Reverend New Dealer, because he was the biggest Catholic proponent of of Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, why do I mention this? All three constantly justified their positions in terms of Quadragesimo Anno, Rerum Novarum, and so on. All three appealed to the same authorities. What made them different with their non-Catholic alliances, which right, left, and in power, and in the end, none of them got anything. Each of the three were true to their particular alliances, which had divided them from each other, and all failed to get what they wanted. And that's another ongoing motif in Catholic history: these united fronts that never really work, and if anything, end up as causes of division between Catholics and other Catholics. So here, what is Belloc really saying? Well, to go back to his ad hominems for a moment, he castigates some, in a fairly satirical manner, several important chunks of the Catholic community of his day to justify an alliance with something so completely non-Catholic. But in that is very typical of us modern Catholics, and possibly an example of why we've been so successful.
It's interesting, just focusing on your point of expediency, and again, the idea of the religious cause attached to forces who are aligned with antithetical forces. We can't overlook the fact that Napoleon was just that. And yet, the irony, of course, being that his 1801 Concordat with the Church, which typified relations with the Holy See going forward until 1905, was the very Concordat which was revoked, forming the separation between church and state. So the very basis of the relations was formed on one of those expedients which you're alluding to.
It was, and it's interesting too. I mean, this is a little off topic, but it's an interesting fact to it, I suppose. There was a great deal of opposition from ultra-Catholics, shall we say, to the Concordat when it was first brought in. And the reason for that isn't very difficult to understand. The church gave up various rights and so forth that people had actually died for. And if you were a relation or friend of one of those who had died for it, you wouldn't be all that keen on having it signed away with the stroke of a pen, no matter who wielded the pen. And the most extreme of these folk later became what was called the Petite Église, which was a schismatic group, which survives to this day in tiny numbers. But what was funny about it was that in the beginning, especially after 1815 and the Restoration, the members of the Petite Église faced really, really nasty civil and ecclesiastical penalties. Well, Fast forward, the civil penalties were vanished with the fall of the Restoration in 1830. The ecclesiastical penalties were lifted by Pius XII. So rather than going through this long routine of accepting the Concordats, which they had to do ritualistically if they wanted to be reconciled to the church, all you had to do was go to confession and communion. So at what point does the importance of the thing change, you know? If it was so important to one's soul to accept the Concordat, well, never mind. You get where I'm going. These are the sorts of historical conundra that make this period so fascinating, and almost, well, they give a certain amount of light into our current situation.
Definitely.
You know, when nothing is new under the sun, what do you do when you're, how do you react to the ecclesiastical and the temporal authority giving you burdens that you can't in conscience bear? What do you do? And Belloc, you know, he came up with a solution which is a very common one. And mind you, I admire Belloc tremendously. He was a great clarifier of my thought when I was in college. You know, he's extraordinary. But like the rest of us, he had his limitations. And I mean, I'm afraid there were certain things that he really couldn't quite overcome. Of course, you notice another funny thing there is going on about the squire and all that. Look at how many of his friends were squires. He ended up as one himself. You know, he was definitely the squire of Kingsland by the time he was done, with the whole neighborhood coming in at Christmas and all this sort of thing, which is great. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for it. But the point I'm making is that he, in certain areas, he was very confused, you know, and the confusion was between his declared notions and his truly Catholic instinct, if that makes sense. I really have been able to visit his grave a couple of times. It's always quite a thrill, because, as I say, I'm a tremendous fan. But in this area, you know, he's trying to square the circle, and the circle can't be squared.
I think I would like to hear your thoughts, Theo, because you've been very quiet.
Well, just to pick up on a few different points that have been made, I think Charles just summarized perfectly the great attributes and flaws, the great qualities and errors that Belloc evinced very succinctly there. So I would agree with all of that. Just to go back to his blame that he attributes towards some of these other French revolutionary figures, Fouché, who's definitely very much a nasty piece of work, but it's even worse than you laid out there. Actually, AM, he even blames the victims themselves, the Catholics who were sent to the guillotine, and the king and queen as being traitors. And enemies of the general will. This is the kind of totalitarian implications of contractualism, of the errors of following this liberal logic of popular sovereignty, that those who go against the general will put themselves outside the political community, and you know, sentence can be executed against them, especially under martial law. He's not sympathetic of the Vendéans. As well, so it's pretty galling to read, but I think
galling.
It's exactly a galling. His thought is marked by a development and maturation. So, for example, his work as a propagandist during the First World War about the German peril as an existential threat, and how that extended to his criticisms of Austria-Hungary, for example, which I know Charles will feel particularly keenly about. That he saw this polity as an anomaly in modern Europe because it was this amalgam of nations somehow without a place in modern Europe, given that, in fact, the principle of unity of the Habsburg Empire was, of course, fidelity to the Habsburg family, but principally the Catholic religion. And in that way, Austria-Hungary was a standing rebuke to the hysterical nationalism, which is derivative of liberalism, of the other nation states, and why it was marked for destruction by the enemies of the church. So there are all sorts of problems there. But later on in his life, Belloc slightly rode back from that those positions against the German people as a whole. So I think we have to credit him with that. But one thing that I think has been acknowledged but is worth repeating is that Belloc was an absolutely formidable polemicist and debater. I mean, if he was here, he would be able to destroy sort of every one of our criticisms, I'm sure, that we might be leveling against him. I think you've probably heard this anecdote before, but Orson Welles, who was debating Belloc about evolution, said that debating Belloc was like arguing with a hailstorm. And there was another meeting of another with another very famous English Catholic at the time, one J.R.R. Tolkien, which was related by Father Martin Darcy. And Father Darcy writes, quote, "Picture the scene, an expectant audience, which includes the great Catholic writer J.R.R. Tolkien, awaiting the arrival of another great Catholic writer, Hilaire Belloc, the latter of whom has been invited by the university chaplain, Monsignor Ronald Knox, to give a talk to the Catholic chaplaincy at Oxford University. Seated just behind Tolkien as Belloc gives his talk is a celebrated Jesuit, Father Martin Darcy, who records what subsequently transpired in his memoirs. In his talk, Belloc came out with one of his pet themes, that the Anglo-Saxons were utterly unimportant in the history of England. Just as a parenthesis, he says famously that what we know of English history began on a hill in Sussex in 1066. Thus underlining his Franco, his pride in his Frankish origins and also Sussex background. And then
just to emphasize the fundamental shameless patriotism and contradiction in that point. We can look at the Franks as Germanic overlords on the one hand, but the Anglo-Saxons should embrace their Norman Frankish oppressors.
And Darcy relates, now there was present on this occasion a man who was probably the greatest authority in the world on Anglo-Saxon subjects and was the professor of Anglo-Saxon history at the time. He is presently professor of English literature at Oxford. The man's name is Tolkien, and he was a very good Catholic. Well, Tolkien disagreed profoundly with Belloc on the question of the Anglo-Saxons. He was sitting just in front of me, and I saw him writhing as Belloc came out with some of his more extreme remarks. So during the interval, I said to him, "Oh, Tolkien, now you've got your chance. You'd better tackle him." He looked at me and said, "Gracious me, do you think I would tackle Belloc unless I had my head?" End quote. He knew Belloc would always pull some fact out of his sleeve which would disconcert you. So, Belloc had tremendous rhetorical, polemical skills, which I think are not to be discounted. But just to go back to his thoughts on republicanism, I think it's worth acknowledging there is a sort of middle polity here, which perhaps Belloc had in mind. A sort of republican monarchy. Alan Phimister is a great champion of this, what he calls Arthurian republicanism, something I've talked to Charles about before, which is a mixed regime with a strong democratic element, perhaps with an elective monarchy, which of course there is precedent in Christian history for, obviously the Holy Roman Empire, and the most long-lived of Christian polities in the whole of history, the Byzantine Empire. So perhaps that's what Belloc was driving at. And I don't know if you are familiar with his thoughts on Napoleon Bonaparte, because Alan Phimister regards Napoleon as a great tragedy of Arthurian republicanism, that he had a chance to work with Pius VII and restore a kind of meritocratic monarchy that he claims, following Emmanuel Sayers here, was swept away by the Sicambrians, Welches, and other savages from the woods and swamps of ancient Germany. The foul Talerand persuaded the first consul to recognize Catholicism not as the one true religion, but merely as that of the consul himself and that of the greater number of the French people, the Concordat. A still more wonderful opportunity presented itself when Bonaparte sought the purple and the blessing of the Pope to do so. Napoleon then committed two further terrible errors. He took the title French and not Roman emperor, and he made his office hereditary. Thus he tied his laurels to a mere nation and fell back into the blood superstition of the barbarians. End quote. So, yes, I don't know if that's something that Belloc engaged with.
No, it's very pertinent, because Belloc wrote his own biography of Napoleon in 1932. That itself should be very revealing to all of us. The fact that he decided to write about Danton at the age of 29, but only decided to cover Napoleon in the 1930s, during his 60s. If he were sincerely attached to this idea of the Principate, then Napoleon would obviously be the stand-in. Indeed, the fact that he was responsible for the 1801 Concordat. So why does he feature so, again, belatedly in the serious Republican thoughts of in his serious sort of Republican thought? Indeed, you can say this is a moment. This is around the same time of the publication of Louis XIV, that his Republican zeal is suffering diminution. So it's only when he becomes more monarchist in the classical sense does he decide to embrace this greater figure who could represent this monarchical republic in the form of Napoleon. And if you read his biography of Napoleon, he has very little to say about the implications of the republic per se. He's not a great champion of the consulate. He does admit that Napoleon was a truly republican force, that the destruction of Napoleon in 1815 allowed for the forces of quote-unquote reaction, or old Europe, to return with a vengeance, essentially. But beyond that, I don't really see much of a theoretical explanation. He seems far more invested in the original quote-unquote French Revolution following 1789 up until the terror of 1794 than he does in a figure like Napoleon. And just to emphasize, again, to reaffirm your point, the notion that there could have been this greater Catholic reconciliation. Well, he starts off potentially as the Emperor of the Romans. There is this idea that there could have been a metamorphosis as the conquest continued, that with his son as the King of Rome, he would have ultimately assumed the title of Emperor of the Romans, and he would have adopted the Quirinial Palace as his primary residence in that sense. But then again, he turns into Philip IV and commits this great Gallican act of sacrilege against the universal church by revoking the donations of Pepin and then locking Pius VII up. So all of these idiosyncrasies and contradictions regarding Gallicanism and the Catholic Church are encapsulated in a figure like Napoleon. And I wish that Belloc, from this point of view, and for the sake of us and these rather oblique references, would go into this. But therefore, we have to return to the element with which Belloc is most insistent regarding his republicanism, which is the constitution of the clergy in the 1790s. So going back to the excerpt that I was reading, and thank you both for your wonderful contributions. This doctrine is opposed, it is impossible for the theologian or even for the practical ecclesiastical teacher to put his finger upon a political doctrine essential to the revolution and to say, this doctrine is opposed to Catholic dogma or to Catholic morals. Conversely, it is impossible for the Republican to put his finger upon a matter of ecclesiastical discipline or religious dogma and say, this Catholic point is at issue with my political theory of the state. Thousands of active men upon either side who have only been too willing during the last 100 years to discover some issue, and it is proved undiscoverable. In a word, Only those Democrats who know little of the Catholic Church can say that of its nature it forbids democracy, and only those Catholics who have confused or imperfect conception of democracy can say that of its nature it is antagonistic to the Catholic Church. And again, this is written as part of a history, and if you're writing this in a modern, even a popular history, you would be rightly lambasted for having such a partisan view referring to modern events, informing your understanding of history. Much that is taught by the purely temporal theory of the one is different to the transcendental and supernatural philosophy of the other. In some points where there is contrast, as in the conception of the dignity of man and the equality of men, there is agreement, again, the basis of his quote-unquote Christian democracy. To sum up, the Republican cannot by his theory persecute the Church cannot by theory excommunicate the Republican, going back to de Maistre in the Consideration of France, that he believes the Republic is by necessity atheistic, a claim that I think you can rightly label against the French Revolution, against the Third Republic itself. And again, in a tragic irony, Belloc references this. He references the fact that by the late 1920s, the Republic is controlled by a number of spiteful Huguenots and Jews and atheists, all conglomerating together to frustrate his idealistic notion of the great sort of untrammeled Catholic democracy. But just to again emphasize that point, de Maistre believed that if the Republic was necessarily atheistic, then it is the obligation again to execute the atheist. So again, a complete and utter contradiction between the ideas of de Maistre and Belloc. To those who ask why a conflict existed between the Church and the forces of revolution, and again, Belloc, through most of his writings and the later writings he refers to in Louis XIV, that this was a misfire, the revolution, that it didn't embrace a Catholic character. But within this work, he implies there is a misunderstanding. The actions of men are divided not by theories, but by spiritual atmospheres, as it were. And this, I would say, reaffirms his indebtedness to Carlyle. According to this view, men act under impulses, but not ideal, but actual impulses which affect great numbers, and yet in their texture correspond to the complex but united impulses of an individual personality. And he doesn't cite it here, but the obvious implication is actually Danton. Thus, there would be no conflict demonstrable between the theology of the Catholic Church and the political theory of the Revolution. Yet, there may be necessary and fundamental conflict between the persons we call the Revolution and the Church, and between the vivifying principles by which either lives. And these he refers to as anti-historical responses to the nature of the quarrel. There was no quarrel between the theology of the Catholic Church and the political theory of the Revolution, but the folly of this statesman, the ill drafting of that law, the misconceptions of such and such an institution, the coincidence of war breaking out at such and such a moment and affecting men in such and such a fashion. And again, this is coincidentalism, or just, it was only by, again, his constant affirmation that it's a misfiring that the revolution simply assumed its character. And this is another aspect which he refers to. You may say that the revolution was the expression of a spirit far more real than any theory, and this reality was in conflict with another reality, the Catholic Church, again referring to Carlyle. In this, he's explicitly referring to the idea that there is an antichrist made manifest in the revolution as a potential counter, again, to his own convictions that there is no sort of irreconcilable nature between the revolution and the Catholic Church. And this is ironic, actually, because in the French Revolution, he points to this fact, this thing which I think informs so much of de Maistre's understanding of the French Revolution, that there is a spiritual element, that there is a atheistic goddess of reason in conflict between the Catholic Church at the Sentinel in France, again referencing his Gallicanism. But he's prepared to say that a historian can't involve himself in such abstract notions. It has to be a materialist understanding of history, which again is ironic considering he is employing so much theoretical understanding of his own views on Catholic democracy to his history, which again is very anti-historical. I will go on because again, this is absolutely key to his understanding. But do either of you have any thoughts in passing regarding that passage?
Theo?
Only just to reiterate, really, this is where the heart of Belloc's error lies, as I see it, that if you were to present to him the Church's teaching on political philosophy, he would affirm the fundamental principles that society is natural, it's not contractual, that authority comes from God, not from the people, that authority is limited by natural and divine law, hence his critique of so-called absolute monarchy. Fine, and that revolutionary ideology is disordered. But then to claim that there's no problem with the theory of the revolution as it proceeded, those are his words, and the theology of the church is just a category error. It's, as we've discussed. So yeah, that's the biggest problem.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I would just add further, he wrote a book called, in 1920, called The House of Commons and Monarchy, in which he talks about the oligarchy that runs the time, and that at some point, England must become a monarchy again. And he says, conceivably, this is how he ends the book, conceivably in another condition of affairs, for instance, if England had been a continental power instead of an insular one, the prime minister might have developed into a new form of monarch. As it is, with the decline of aristocracy, the value of the prime ministership has disappeared. The prime minister does not govern today, and the office has ceased to be respected. For it was the product of aristocracy, and in the absence of the aristocratic spirit, it has lost its essential. Our present prime minister is a puppet, and his successors, though they may be more reputable in private life, will be puppets too. The monarchy may not come, in which case the state as we have known it will dissolve. It will either form part of a larger federation to be controlled from abroad, or it will lose its own character from within. Especially, it will lose its proud position before the world outside. But if in the alternative, monarchy comes, it may come in any one of 1,000 ways, through the unexpected development of a new institution or of an old institution, or through the resurrection of a dead institution. It may come, and that would be the best way because the most continuous, through the return to power of what is now the hereditary house. Or it may come through an elective machinery. Or it may come through the accidental popularity of one man in some important crisis of the Commonwealth, or in any other way. But come monarchy must, if the greatness and the homogeneity of the nation are not to be maintained, are to be maintained. And these the English will not readily or easily abandon. End of book, end of quote. The problem we also have with Belloc and monarchy is that, Theo mentioned earlier, sacred absolute monarchy, Catholic monarchy, the monarchy of the crown. For him, monarchy was a much more elastic term. I think in some sense, we touched on this earlier, he saw Cromwell as a monarch, albeit not a good one. So I think he didn't have a discernment of the difference between mere rule by one man and rule by a man crowned and anointed by the church and serving professedly as God's lieutenant. And that latter was possibly a concept he never really understood or explored.
I think that is actually quite fundamental, because I would say in the abstract, talking about political systems, I would use the same elastic principle, but I wouldn't say therefore that all monarchies are alike or all monarchies are created equal in that sense. I would completely and vehemently disagree with that position. And he is right in the sense. I think what's also quite remarkable is that 1920, to provide a bit of context, he's talking about David Lloyd George. And if there was any charismatic prime minister of the 20th century other than Winston Churchill, you may look to someone like a Margaret Thatcher or a David Lloyd George. So the fact that he even refers to David Lloyd George as a puppet, an argument could be made, but we'll be veering off too far to actually explore it, is in itself very revealing and interesting. Because you can say that David Lloyd George is actually one of the first of these quote-unquote monarchical prime ministers, other than, say, for example, an arbitrator who his predecessor Asquith most certainly was, and indeed lending credence to this idea of Cromwell as a monarch. And again, this was simply buttress the point I was making earlier about Carlyle, in that the great man essentially of history may manifest in many guises, and it doesn't really matter if there is a sacred aspect to it, in which case the notion of monarchy and greatness, decisiveness, again, this is something he would refer to in Mussolini, certainly, compared to a figure within the political system of Britain. So it's important to consider that he would look at Mussolini as a monarch, and he would not perhaps even consider Vittorio Emanuele III within that estimation. But that's actually a nice way to segue, because he now talks about the absolute monarchy. And it's the absolute monarchy which, for him, is the key to understand why the French Revolution has legitimacy. And he goes on and says this: there are two elements of disruption in that homogeneous body, being the absolute monarchy, which Louis XIV apparently commanded. The very fact that the church had thus become in France an unshakable national institution chilled the vital source of Catholicism. It should also be mentioned, for the sake again of giving Belloc the benefit of the doubt, in Louis XIV itself, the biography, he will go on and say that Louis XIV was sincere in his desire to make Catholicism the national religion, not just a political pillar of absolute monarchy. Whereas in this earlier work, he seems far more scathing of Louis XIV and his intentions, but he will give that credence to Louis XIV later in his works on history, but he doesn't necessarily give it here. Not only did the hierarchy stand in perpetual suspicion of the Roman See and toy with the conception of national independence, I think he's referring to the Declaration of the Clergy of France in 1680, which is perhaps one of the most bold Gallican statements of the Church, before the declaration of the clergy, the Constitution of the Clergy in the Revolution. But they and all the official organizations of French Catholicism put the security of the national establishment and its intimate attachment to the general political structure of the state far beyond the sanctity of Catholic dogma or the practice of Catholic morals. And like I said, he rose back the severity of that declaration. But the fact that Belloc in his prime would say such a thing, again, is incredibly damning against the whole notion of a sacred monarchy, because he would place sacred monarchy very clearly in quotes here, believing that it was more a political ploy, and it basically destroyed Catholicism as a result. Had it indeed survived, the church in Gaul would doubtless, in spite of his attachment to so mundane thing as a crown, just again reaffirming all of that, have still survived to enjoy one of those resurrections which have never failed in the past and would have returned by some creative reaction to its principle of life. But for the moment, the consequence of this fixed political establishment was that skepticism and all those other active forces of the mind which play upon the religion in any Catholic state had full opportunity. The church was, so to speak, not concerned to defend itself, but only its method of existence. It was as though a garrison, forgetting the main defences of a place, had concentrated all its efforts upon the security of one work which contained all its supplies of food. And by extension, he's therefore intimating very clearly that the Catholic Church in France was only concerned with filling its own trough, that it was concerned with materialism more so than anything else, which again is an incredibly damning indictment. Wit, good verse, sincere enthusiasm, a lucid exposition of whatever in the human mind perpetually rebels against transcendental affirmations were allowed in every latitude and provoked no reply. While in the wealthy, the bureaucratic, and the governing classes, to ridicule the faith was an attitude taken for granted. It did not shock the hierarchy that one of its apostolic members should be a witty atheist. And this is very interesting, because I did a series on Talerand, Charles-Maurice Talerand, who of course was the Bishop of Autun. And in your presentation, Theo, on the Ralliement, you were careful to explore this whole idea that there was a genealogy of liberal Catholicism. I place that in quotes because all of that has to be, contentious. And you mentioned Dupanloup, and he, of course, was one of the figures behind, you can say, I won't say a stronger word as conspiracy, but an attempt during the later life of Talleyrand in the 1830s to see him receive absolution and come back into the full graces of the church and receive confession. He was one of the primary instigators of that. And so it is actually through a figure like Talerand, who was not just a juring priest, he was a juring bishop. He had consecrated bishops without authority from Rome, and for that he received his excommunication. But the fact that Talerand is so integral a figure in this would actually lend credence to your idea of a genealogy of influences that we come from Talerand to Dupanloup, and of course the Rallemont, the French Third Republic. So I just want to buttress that point you made in those presentations. The abandonment of religion by all but a very few of the French millions, no more affected by the ecclesiastical officials of the time, does the starvation of our poor affect. Let us say one of our professional politicians. It was a thing simply taken for granted. Many official acts, notable marriages, and the registration of births took place under a Catholic form, and indeed Catholic forms had a monopoly of them. Again, the state wore Catholic clothes, as it were, the public occasions of pomp were full of religious ceremony. Few of the middle classes went to mass in the great towns, hardly any of the artisans, but the churches were official. Great sums of money, including official money, were at the disposal of the church, and the great ecclesiastics were men from whom solid favors could be got. And looking at that, first of all, it's incredibly unfavorable, I would say, and to the point that he will later critique his own sort of vehemence towards the whole nature of the apostolic state and say it was simply a creature of the monarchy, and thereby the monarchy is itself impugned by that association, and that Catholicism therefore cannot properly thrive within a monarchy. I think his appraisal or misappraisal of absolutism, therefore, is key. But it also chimes, I would say, with many non-Catholic historians. So, for example, a very good book I would recommend from a non-Catholic perspective on this period would be Dale Van Clay's on the religious causes of the French Revolution, which very much echoes the sentiment, but also the doctoral thesis of or perhaps one of the most famous, or was one of the most famous German conceptual historians, Reinhard Koselleck, in his Critique of Crisis, emphasizes this point that there is a almost Gnostic Manichaean aspect to the French revolutionaries who were part of society that was locked out of the Catholic superstructure of the national church, and thereby there was a religious momentum which had to overcome the church in association with absolutism, and thereby absolutism in itself became discredited within broader French society. But I think we would all agree, looking at that there are errors in how absolutism basically carried out in terms of its historical trajectory. My personal theory on absolutism essentially is that it was a band-aid solution to the French wars of religion and the Fronde, that the monarchy assumed all powers to himself in order to prevent what we saw with Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes, the idea that the political state or the politiques that existed as they did during the French wars of religion should simply be there to preserve the religious peace. Louis XIV instead takes that much further, and to his credit, he, again, from the point of view of a Catholic, he revokes the Edict of Nantes, he issues the Edict of Fontainebleau, and makes Catholicism the state religion of absolutist France. And that is something that Belloc can't take away from him, that sincere belief that France must be made Catholic and that the political state simply won't exist as sovereignty for the sake of maintaining order, as Hobbes essentially would infer. But I want to now pass that idea to either of you who would like to speak first regarding his complete admonition against French absolutism.
Well, I couldn't help but think of Demest's own critique of French absolutism, in the sense that he believed that elements of it did, in fact, pave the way for the revolution, which he does not see as a good thing, obviously, Demest. But the point you made about being a band-aid was not untrue either. You have, we look at the Catholic synthesis of the Middle Ages. It lasted, and now I'm not just dealing with France, because the absolute state, quote unquote, ended up arising everywhere. And there were reasons for it. Part of it was that the Catholic synthesis of the Middle Ages was given not to despotism. Its major Achilles heel was the tendency to anarchy and civil war. And this came about because you didn't have a state in the modern sense. If the emperor or the king needed to discipline someone, and they were a powerful nobleman, because power was so diffuse, authority was concentrated in the church and the monarch, but power was very diffuse. All he could really do was declare a person, place, or thing an outlaw, thus giving his neighbors permission to punish him and take his stuff if they could. So that was, if you study medieval history, that's this sort of thing happens over and over again. Mind you, a lot of the time things work the way they should, but when it didn't work, it was pretty noticeable. So, in response to all of that, gradually, and other factors, the modern state begins to come into being. The Protestant revolt really sends it on its way, both in the Protestant countries and in Catholic countries in response. And then, in France in particular, you have the wars of religion, which, I mean, people don't realize how devastating the wars of religion were in France, and what an extraordinary work both Henry IV and Louis XIII did in rebuilding the country. And it had to be rebuilt. It was in its way, rebuilding the church and state in France after the wars of religion was in its way quite as complex and thoroughgoing as the Restoration in the early 19th century. And I don't just mean the political restoration, 1850 to 1830. I mean the whole rebuilding of the French church in the first half of the 19th century, which was itself an amazing feat. So you have Louis XIV reacting not just to the Huguenots, but also, and this, one of the major tragedies of European Catholic history has been the 200 years of antipathy between France and the House of Habsburg. You know, that's the elephant in the room that we haven't touched on. But the sad truth of the fact is that the alliance between the two concluded in 1756 would have been a lot more helpful had it been 200 years earlier. History would have been quite different.
It's very interesting that you. Sorry, I will let you continue.
Well, I just mentioned, you know, it's ironic also that never was the antipathy greater than when you had kings with Habsburg mothers and consorts in France.
And this is, I think, what I find so baffling about Belloc's point of view, because again, it seems to be he is damning monarchy by association to what he believes to be the worst vices of the decadent ancien regime during the worst elements of, say, for example, Louis XV's reign, so around the 1760s. And yet you raise a very important point. There seems to be an inherent contradiction here, which is that Henry IV and, by extension, his son Louis XIII, through the brilliant sort of magistracy of Cardinal Richelieu, built up a more Catholic, more absolutist state in order to wage war against the Habsburgs. In the same way, Louis XIV did the exact same thing. And you can say, had he triumphed completely, and worse, had the Turks taken Constantinople in 1683, that French Gallicanism would have basically superseded the Catholic Church in Europe as a whole. And we would have seen the creation, you could say, of a new Charlemagne by the ruination of the other great Catholic power in Europe at that time. Also including Habsburg Spain, possibly, because he was fighting wars constantly against the Spanish. So we take all of that into consideration, and there was an awareness at the time. Of course, there had to be an awareness at the time of the fundamental contradiction of establishing a resolutely national Catholic Church, expelling the Huguenots, whilst also waging war upon broader Catholicism. And I believe you see that reaction among the devout faction, among figures such as Archbishop Fenelon and the court around the Duke of Burgundy, who was the grandson of Louis XIV. Then, of course, the smallpox outbreak occurs in 1711, and much of the House of Bourbon suffer tragedy, including the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy. And so it's left to the great grandson of Louis XIV without this special education, and as a result of this program towards the renewal of European Christendom, Catholicism, and not just Gallicanism for its own sake, you can say as one of the most unfortunate aspects for the absolute monarchy. But it's interesting again that Belloc does not. His concern essentially is we're trying to reify the revolution and not seeing where absolutism effectively went wrong in a more, you can say, all-encompassing universal sense. And I find that rather revealing in terms of the intentions without trying to go into those ad hominems that we've been trying to avoid throughout this conversation.
Well, they are easy, sadly. But no, I just also point out that it's interesting, too, that the fight between Bourbon and Habsburg led to two of what have to be considered the most egregious mistakes popes have ever made. One was Urban VIII backing the Swedish and then the French against the Habsburgs during the 30 Years' War. And then 50 years later, Alexander VI backing William of Orange against James II.
Snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Gosh, we can lose like nobody else, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So I just want to I want to conclude Belloc's line of thought before we end this conversation, because it's all been leading up to somewhere and we can't avoid it. And this is going back to the Constitution of the Clergy. The men who framed the Constitution of the Clergy, the men who voted it, nay, even the men who argued against it, all had the back of their minds three conceptions which they were attempting to reconcile. Of those three conceptions, one was wholly wrong, one was imperfect because superficial, the third alone was true. And these were the conceptions. First, that the Catholic Church was a moribund superstition. Secondly, that it possessed its organization and tradition a power to be reckoned with. And third, that the state, its organs, and their corporate inheritance of action were so bound up with the Catholic Church that it was impossible to effect any general political settlement in which that body, both external to France and internal, should be neglected. The historic truth is masked by language and point of view of the great Catholic reaction which has taken place in our time. In other words, we shouldn't focus too much on the first point, which is the vehement anti-Catholicism of the revolutionaries, which far more secular historians, including Koselleck, are more than likely to point to, Masonry and Gnosticism and Manichaeanism. Rather, we should be fixated on the last point, which is that the Catholic Church is too involved in the actions of the state, which just so happens to be a monarchy. And by extension, there is some process of reification of the Catholic Church placed in opposition to the atheist republicans in the aftermath of the Ralliement, that there could not be a great Catholic renewal without opposition, essentially. And this is a point he makes also in Louis XIV, which is that he believes that Catholicism in Ireland, Belloc, was so strong because of his opposition to the Ulstermen, that the Catholicism in Belgium was so strong because of his opposition to the Netherlands, and vice versa. Other parts, say, for example, of Catholic Europe against Protestantism, that the Edict of Fontainebleau basically robbed France of that contrast between extremes and opposition towards Protestantism. And we've already belabored the point that the great horrific irony of all of this is that Catholic Christendom should be rendered asunder by two Catholic powers fighting against each other. And that essentially is his central thesis, that it leads to this sense of religious inertia And I find it almost remarkable because that, again, seems to be a very secular argumentation that it is, I mean, obviously in sort of more recent historiography, I've actually alluded to it, it's this process of othering, that the Catholic Church can only be maintained in friction to a antithesis. And you can look at that and say that there are so many modern ideas, Fichtean, Hegelian ideas, which are bound up in this overall thesis, which Belloc is presenting, to the point that he may not even be aware of it. But I think that is the fundamental error that underpins his whole sort of sympathy towards the French Revolution, that you can extricate the third point from the first point, that there is ideologically an irreconcilable point among the revolutionaries who he is trying to form a sympathetic sort of reconciliation with. So take Robespierre, for example. He referred to his principles as a tabernacle. He's using Christian references to Rousseau and the philosophy of Rousseau. And it's the fact that Robespierre has these principles that makes him a Catholic, even though he's not aware of it, even though Robespierre would be the first one to tell you, I'm a lapsed Catholic and all of my beliefs have superseded that. So, and he even says this about Carlyle, it should be mentioned. He believes that Carlyle is more of a Catholic thinker than a Calvinist thinker. So he's almost trying to retroactively apply Catholicism to antithetical forces. And that's sort of where I want to leave the general conversation, because it seems that that is the point and that is the contention. And I want to, I would say, give it over to Theo first, because yes, it's a crucial point in understanding Belloc and his potential misapprehension.
Just to pick up on the first Belloc quotation you gave there, AM, of his scathing diagnosis of the state of the church in pre-revolutionary France, that is where I have much more sympathy for Belloc. I think he's quite perceptive there. And to his credit, for example, he criticized Cardinal Richelieu and his raison d'etat ideology, that the polity could be divorced from ethics in its pursuit of national interest. The church in France was in a dire state before the French Revolution. Famously, of course, the decrees of Trent had not been promulgated. Just to give one example, of the 237 Cistercian monasteries in France, only 35 were governed by resident abbots. The rest were all run by commendatory abbots, benefices, these venal posts often occupied by laity.
I think conversely, though, I want you to continue your point, but just conversely, to give the French state some benefit, the contrary argument essentially is that the French state was simultaneously too vehement in the implementation of Catholic uniformity, like we see with the encyclical Unigenitus, or the papal bull Unigenitus, which prohibited Jansenism. And as a result, Jansenism is prohibited, and yet many crypto-Jansenists become very prominent in the Parlement throughout all of France, and they become the vehicles of the French Revolution. So it seems that any way you cut it, whether it be a laxity of implementation of edicts from Rome or an overzealous application, it seems to result in the same thing.
Yeah, I think Belloc is right that absolute monarchy, divine right of kings, it was a solvent of Catholicism in pre-revolutionary France. I do agree with him there. Wasn't the only one, but to sort of divinize the monarch and to sort of derive the warrant from his obedience, not based on his. I mean, obviously, they would affirm the fact that he was the appointed representative of God on earth, but to sunder that from the universality of the spiritual power in Rome, headed in Rome, I think was ultimately destructive. So I think he's right there. The church was in a state. There were whole regions, John Rao discusses, of France who had not seen a bishop in years. There were large congregations of Catholics who had not received the sacrament of confirmation, for example. But we had the accession to the throne of Louis XVI, who was actually genuinely devout. He was from the devout party, and the diplomatic revolution that Charles mentioned also boded well for the Catholic cause. So I think Belloc's his diagnosis is severe, but it has a lot of truth to it. And if I can raise one more facet of this, which I think, as I indicated at the beginning, lies behind a lot of Belloc's seemingly incoherent or contradictory views on the French Revolution, something that's not often appreciated is that Rousseau was a strong critic of usury. And so I think the economic dimension is really important to acknowledge here, because that became a more and more important part of Belloc's overall thought throughout his life. And there's an interesting book by Bernard Groythuysen called The Bourgeois, A History of Catholicism versus Capitalism in 18th century France, where he documents the Catholic preaching against the rising power of money and usury and rent seeking in Ancien Regime France, which Rousseau was also critical of. His famous quotation, "Man was born free and he is everywhere in chains," it not only refers, in his view, to the tyranny of absolute monarchy, but I suppose people like Belloc would interpret it as the power of money, that Rousseau saw money in the classical sense as a medium of exchange rather than a commodity to produce more money. And the conditions, as you've discussed in previous broadcasts, were really bad, with the rise of the rentier class, the rising of rents rising faster than wages, peasants paying up to 50% of their income on rents, dues, and taxes, the rise of sharecropping. And this is why later on, I talked about this in my recent video on primogeniture, Belloc actually supported the abolition of primogeniture and mandatory partable inheritance as this great policy of distributism. So that, I think, is at play here as well. That he's deeply frustrated. He was deeply critical of this rentier bourgeois class, which in the Parliament were blocking tax reform and leading to this, the fiscal crisis that sparked the whole revolution.
It's funny too, though, when you think about it, because one element of the French Revolution was the demand of this bourgeoisie to have a much bigger share in power. And what was their party? The Gironde. And who was their spokesman? Danton. So you have some very funny elements there. The other thing too, and our host touched on it a moment ago. The coming of Louis XVI to the throne. This was a lost opportunity that I don't think Belloc was ever really fully aware of what a lost opportunity it was. I'd recommend on this point a book by Bernard Fay called Louis XVI or the End of a World. And he points out a number of things, one of them being that Louis XVI's reforms over the first 4 years of his reign were really what paved the way for France to do such a creditable job militarily and economically against Britain in the War of the American Revolution, which was a world war. One of the terrible ironies, of course, is that a war that began with a great deal of anti-Catholic spirit, the revolutionaries had to change their tune when they acquired two major Catholic allies who made their victory possible, France and Spain. The downside, other than turning George III off on Catholic emancipation because he felt betrayed by his brother monarchs jumping in on the thing, beyond that, it bankrupted France. And it unfortunately set in motion the events that would lead to the revolution. Because 1788, you have the great eruption of the Iceland volcano, the crops fail, the terrible position that so many of the farmers were already in becomes horribly exacerbated by this, the Great Hunger. Now, normally, the king would have taken out loans, he would have opened up the royal granaries, etc. Couldn't do that. The American War had eaten all that up. And it is one of the great ironies that in pulling off the first French victory against Britain in a long time, the king unwittingly set the stage for what happened. And this, too, the effect of the American Revolution on France is something that Belloc doesn't really deal with, for the same reason a lot of American Catholic historians can't and won't. He had a great deal of affection for the United States, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it just shows the most brilliant of us can make the most extraordinary mistakes.
Right.
I just want to reaffirm your point, actually, regarding the last sort of redoubt of the politics of the devout faction, which is, you mentioned, well, this is actually the fruits of the Pacte de Famille, that France would come to ally with so many Catholic powers. But also Louis XVI was the only king who cared about the fate of Catholic Poland on the eve of partitions as well, which is a point that often many people forget. And I think a tragic irony, going back to the civil constitution of the clergy, I mentioned Talleyrand. At the time of Talleyrand's excommunication, he said that from the point of view of his own atheistic appreciation of the Catholic Church, that the revolution was in the right regarding the nationalization of church property and regarding the civic oath, and that eventually the Catholic Church will have to come and accept this as the state of affairs and embrace it. And unfortunately, Talleyrand was completely correct in terms of that prophecy.
Well, indeed, and of course, I always like the story of Talleyrand's death. He sent a messenger to get a priest, and he was very much afraid of dying before the priest should get there. So he was heard to whisper over and over, "Just one more treaty, oh Lord, just one more treaty."
So I think this takes us to the end of our conversation, and thank you both for your wonderful contributions. Theo, do you have anything to say broadly in summation?
Just to echo what Charles said there, that Belloc, with regard to this issue, most saliently, is a salutary lesson about how some of the prejudices that we might have can color our thinking and divert us from Catholic truth, and that's something I think we should be vigilant to stop, because it can lead to all these sort of intellectual contortions that we've sort of been through today, and ultimately quite a incoherent picture. But as Charles mentioned earlier, Christianity is about incarnation, and so when Belloc I think he famously said, actually, I think it was with regard to the US being a monarchy, but that those who would say that it's not, they make the common error of thinking in words instead of ideas. But of course, Christianity is the word made flesh, and the Catholic monarchies of Europe, as corrupted as they might have been, and as in need of reform as they might have been, that providentially they were the legitimate civil authorities of Europe, and there was no justification for revolution, sedition, tyrannical bloodshed, atrocities, invasions, misery right across Europe. Instead, of course, the answer was reform, and there were possibilities there. But there's a deeper question which will have to perhaps be a subject for another time, about why France was the first Catholic society to secularize in the 18th century. And Belloc was indicating that, but there really was something very unique going on there, or something that was original at that time. The historical evidence is there about how, for example, in the historical record of wills around 1750, the majority of French wills, at least in a number of provinces, go from mentioning God and the saints, the Virgin Mary, to being entirely secular, and that's the first time in any Catholic country. Now, I put a lot of the blame personally on Louis XV. I think he was really terrible. With, from a moral perspective, that really undermined the integrity of and witness to the Catholic religion, and of course the way in which he coddled and supported all the destructive Enlightenment atheistic thinkers.
There's one point. I mean, ironically, though, he is also responsible for something that I think Charles and I would both adore, which is the diplomatic revolution, which finally brought the alliance about. But I don't think you're going to find anyone who disagrees with you regarding Louis XV. But there's a point, just before I let you come in, Charles, there is a point which I think is actually quite fundamental, which you sort of alluded to here, which is there is a great hypocrisy regarding Belloc. And you talk about theories and ideas and applications, is that, as we saw from that anecdote with his conversation with the Master of Balliol at the beginning, and that a great republic requires great personages, he was prepared to accept a certain lofty idealism when it came to his notion of the great Stoic Catholic Republic, but he was not prepared to accept that, or basically provide that same courtesy to the idea that monarchy can naturally degrade. Rather, he was prepared to condemn the theory as a result of the historical trajectory of absolute monarchy. It's something he could forgive a republic for, but not monarchy for. And I think that is a fundamental contradiction that undermines essentially all of his thought in that regard.
I'd agree. And I would say also that, if he were alive today, it would be very interesting to see his reaction to how things are now. A good deal of his thinking, especially regarding liberalism and all that, was in the air, oddly enough, and certainly not by people who would have credited him, like Father John Courtney Maistre. But it was in the air at the time of Vatican II, and particularly after. Pope Benedict XVI made a very interesting speech before the German Parliament, in which he declared that the Church was never purer nor more clearly herself and more valid in her missionary outreach, etc., than when she was completely divorced from the state, which is a development of the same sort of ideas. It's historic nonsense, frankly. The Church has never been more divorced from the state than she is now. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know what to tell you. So one can only wonder, with so many of these great figures, what they would make of today. I mean, thank God we rarely get to see our ideas put into practice. So I would just conclude by saying that, as I said earlier, it is a salutary warning, as they were rightly clarified, a salutary warning against allowing ourselves to be influenced by our own prejudices, which means we have to undergo a certain constant re-examination. Why am I, the same sort of critical thinking that we apply to others when we're reading or hearing or whatever. Why is he saying this? Where is he coming from? What is he trying to sell me? We actually have to apply that same critical thought to ourselves. Why do I hold this? Where am I coming from with this? Do I believe this because it has some connection to an objectively true reality? Or because I want to, feel like it, makes me feel better? makes Great Aunt Mamie, the suffragette. No, she doesn't exist. I'm just saying. But Great Aunt Mamie, the suffragette, suddenly, is the reason why I believe there's a God-given right for women to have the vote. Now, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But my Great Aunt Mamie being a suffragette really should not be an influence on how I deal with the issue. So, a salutary warning.
I mean, the last point I'm going to reference is, again, going back to pop psychology and ad hominems, unfortunately, which is, I think, being a Frenchman who was brought up in England and had an English mother, it gave him I mean, you've already alluded to it, Charles. I think it informed so much of his theoretical appreciation for France in the abstract, rather than actually being a Frenchman living in France, using French as his principal language. I think there's an argument to be made there.
No, well, and again, it's something that it's what drew me to Belloc in the first place, to be honest with you, because I recognized in him so many of the same issues that have been with me my entire life. As I say, reading his collected letters and his description of giving a lecture in France, I've done the same thing. I began to get PTSD. I could hear the shells in the background. I broke out in a cold sweat. But
I think, though, you brilliantly broke out of your conditioning by becoming a great Habsburg historian, so you escaped the same fate.
Well, it does help in a sense, because in a certain way, I don't have a dog in this fight. I mean, I do in a way, but it's not. It has helped, and also the temptation of the two great peoples of this world that are the most about themselves, to the exclusion of almost anything else, you would have to say are both the Americans and the French. And being both French and American, I'm all too aware in seeing the clash between the two in my own personality. Which of us is the most perfect? That's the question.
So thank you both very much. We just have one super chat, then we'll get out of here. Aaron Fire 359 for $10. Thank you very much. Sorry I missed this live. Thank you for creating these wonderful videos. Your thoughts and knowledge are sorely needed in this age of the world. Well, thank you very much, Aaron Fire. Before we leave, Theo, anything coming up, anything that the audience should be made aware of?
I'm continuing a series on traditionalist economics on my channel, which people can look out for. I'm hoping to interview David Hunt on usury. Talking of Belloc, we'll be looking at Belloc's definition of usury, and David's written a book recovering the scholastic definition of usury with regard to any kind of loans on a mutuum, interest on a mutuum contract. So that's what's next from me.
Charles?
I'm still writing for Crisis and 1 Peter 5 and Catholicism.org. I've recently concluded with Vinnie Franchini, my longtime interlocutor, our series Off the Menu. Although we just did a Martin Luther King Day holiday special on the book that Joseph Shaw, Jamie Bogle, and myself, and several other people contributed to in defense of monarchy. I'm going to be appearing on a couple of English venues this coming week, talking about The Complete Monarchist, my book from Osjusti Press, and I've gone to work for Pelican Plus, the new Catholic media platform, which I'm doing two things. I'm doing a weekly article for them, and also a weekly show. We'll be starting a new show. In between, I've been doing a series with them on the history of the Holy Roman Empire. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I've got going. I'll be in England from the 27th to the 30th. So I'm looking forward to that.
Regarding your streams on the Holy Roman Empire. Your interlocutor, Murray Rundus, is going to be on this channel in 2 weeks' time, talking about Immanuel Kant, of all things. So, yes, both of you, thank you very much. It's truly been a wonderful conversation. So, to everyone out there, thank you very much for listening, and good night.
Thank you, gentlemen.